Welcome to Tales by Imon. Settle in as we journey into the quiet corners of the unknown, where shadows lengthen and memories whisper. Tonight's story is called The Empty Swing Set at Dusk. The air in the small town of Oakhaven, Illinois, always carried a certain weight at dusk, a heavy blanket woven from the day's fading heat and the coming night's cool breath. It was a time of transition, when the vibrant greens of the town park bled into muted grays and the cheerful sounds of children's laughter were replaced by the lonely chirp of crickets. For most residents, it was a signal to head indoors, to the warm glow of television screens and the familiar comfort of family. But for Elias Thorne, it was a time of vigil. He sat on a weathered bench, his knuckles white as he gripped its peeling paint. Before him, under the ancient, sprawling branches of the park centerpiece, a colossal oak tree, stood the swing set. It was a simple, unassuming structure of metal and faded red plastic, but to Elias, it was a monument to a memory that refused to fade. Two swings hung side by side, their chains glinting faintly in the last vestiges of sunlight. One was perfectly still. The other, however, moved. It swayed gently, a rhythmic, hypnotic motion that seemed to defy the stillness of the evening air. There was no wind. Not a single leaf on the mighty oak above it trembled. Yet, the swing moved, its chains emitting a soft, almost inaudible creak, a sound that echoed only in the vast, silent auditorium of Elias's grief. He had been coming here for a year, every evening, drawn by a desperate hope that was as foolish as it was unbreakable. He was a man in his late 40s, his face etched with a kind of deep lines that aren't earned by age alone, but by sorrow. His once dark hair was now shot through with silver, and his shoulders carried a permanent slump, as if he bore a weight no one else could see. A year ago, this park had been the epicenter of his world. It was where his daughter Lily had spent countless hours, her bright, infectious laughter the soundtrack to his happiest memories. She had loved the swings more than anything, her small legs pumping furiously as she tried to touch the sky, her blonde pigtails flying behind her like golden ribbons. "Higher, Daddy, higher," she would squeal, and he would push her, his heart soaring with every joyful arc she made. Now, the silence she left behind was a chasm, a void that threatened to swallow him whole. The official story was that Lily had wandered off. A tragic accident, they called it. The search had been extensive, involving the entire town and beyond. They had combed every inch of Oakhaven, every field, every forest, every riverbank. But they had found nothing. Not a shoe, not a ribbon, not a single trace of the little girl who had vanished into thin air from this very park, on an evening just like this one, as dusk settled over the empty swings. But Elias knew they were wrong. He knew because of the swing. The one on the right. Lily's swing. It had started moving the day after she disappeared, and it hadn't stopped since. At first, he thought it was just the wind, a cruel trick of the eye. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into a year, he had come to accept the impossible truth. Something was keeping that swing in motion. Tonight, the air felt different. Thicker. A palpable sense of anticipation hung over the park, making the hairs on Elias's arms stand on end. He pulled his worn jacket tighter around himself, his gaze fixed on the gently swaying swing. He had brought a new tool with him tonight, a piece of equipment he had spent his meager savings on, a final, desperate attempt to bridge the gap between his world and wherever Lily had gone. It was an EMF meter, a device that measured electromagnetic fields. He had read about it online, in forums filled with ghost hunters and paranormal investigators, people who, like him, were searching for answers in the shadows. He fumbled in his bag, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out the small, black device. He took a deep breath, the cool air stinging his lungs, and switched it on. The meter's screen flickered to life, displaying a calm, steady green light. He held it up, pointing it towards the empty playground. The light remained green. He swept it over the slide, the monkey bars, the sandbox. Nothing. Then, he pointed it at the swing set. The moment the meter was aimed at Lily's swing, the needle on the device shot into the red, and a high-pitched, insistent squeal pierced the evening silence. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He had expected something, hoped for something, but the raw, tangible evidence of an unseen energy sent a jolt of both terror and exhilaration through him. He took a tentative step forward, the meter's shriek growing louder, more frantic. With each inch he closed the distance. The swing continued its gentle, rhythmic sway, oblivious to the electronic scream that now filled the air. Elias stopped just a few feet away, his eyes wide, his breath hitched in his throat. The needle on the EMF meter was fluctuating wildly, as if it were measuring the frantic heartbeat of an invisible entity. "Lily," he whispered, his voice cracking with a year's worth of unshed tears. "Lily, is that you?" The squeal of the meter was his only answer. The swing swayed back and forth, back and forth. But then, something changed. The rhythm of the swing, which had been as steady and predictable as a metronome, began to falter. It slowed, almost to a stop, before suddenly lurching forward with a force that made the chains groan in protest. It swung higher now, with a desperate, almost violent energy. Elias stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth. This was new. This was different. The gentle, melancholic sway had been replaced by a frenetic, urgent motion. It was as if something was trying to communicate, to break through the veil that separated them. He raised the meter again, his eyes darting between the device and the wildly swinging seat. The needle was no longer just in the red. It was pushing against the very limits of the scale, the squeal of the meter now a constant, ear-splitting shriek. And in that chaotic noise, Elias thought he could hear something else. A whisper, faint, ethereal, like the rustle of leaves in a phantom wind. He strained to listen, to decipher the sound from the electronic noise. It was a single word, repeated over and over, a desperate, pleading sigh. Cold. A chill that had nothing to do with the evening air washed over Elias, seeping deep into his bones. "Lily, where are you?" he cried out, his voice a raw plea to the empty space before him. "Talk to me, please." The swing surged even higher, its arc so wide that for a terrifying moment, Elias thought the chains might snap. The whisper grew stronger, clearer, coalescing from the static. "Help me, Cold." And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The swing came to an abrupt, jarring halt in midair, hanging perfectly still. The shriek of the EMF meter died, the needle dropping back to a placid green. The park was plunged back into a profound silence, broken only by the sound of Elias's own ragged breathing. He stood frozen, his mind reeling, the phantom whisper still echoing in his ears. He knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that he had just made contact with his daughter. And he knew, with a dawning icy dread, that she was trapped somewhere, cold and alone, waiting for him to find her. The empty swing set was no longer just a memorial, it was a beacon. And tonight, for the first time in a year, it had given him a clue. He didn't know where to go, or what to do next. But as he looked at the now motionless swing under the darkening sky, a new steely resolve settled in his heart. He would find her. No matter what it took, he would bring his daughter home. The vigil was over. The hunt had begun. He cast one last glance at the swing, a silent promise passing between a father and the ghost of his child, before turning his back on the park and walking towards the encroaching darkness of the town, the single chilling word, cold, his only guide. The walk home from the park was a blur. Elias moved like an automaton, his feet finding the familiar cracks in the sidewalk without conscious thought. The single word, cold, was a physical presence in his mind, a shard of ice lodged behind his eyes, replaying not just as a sound, but as a feeling. It was the bone-deep chill of a winter fever, the unnerving stillness of a room where a body has just been. The night had fully descended on Oakhaven, draping the quiet, tree-lined streets in an inky blackness punctuated by the lonely orange glow of streetlights. Every shadow seemed to lengthen and twist as he passed, reaching for him with phantom fingers. He clutched the EMF meter in his jacket pocket, its cold, hard plastic a grounding reality in a world that had just been ripped open to reveal the impossible. His house was the last one on a dead-end street, a small two-story home that had once been filled with warmth and light. Now, it was a silent vessel of memories. Unlocking the front door, he stepped into a space that was less a home and more a museum dedicated to a life that had been abruptly paused. Every surface was meticulously clean, yet held a fragile, untouched quality. Lily's small pink rain boots still stood by the door, exactly where she had kicked them off on that final afternoon. Her drawings, vibrant and full of childish wonder, were still held by magnets to the refrigerator door. A half-finished puzzle of a fantasy castle sat on the coffee table, a silent testament to an interrupted game. For a year, Elias had preserved this place, terrified that changing a single thing would be a betrayal, an admission that she was truly gone forever. Tonight, for the first time, the stillness of the house felt different. It wasn't just empty, it was waiting. He bypassed the living room and went straight to the kitchen. His hands, still trembling, cleared the small kitchen table, pushing aside a stack of mail he hadn't bothered to open. From a drawer beside the pantry, he retrieved his prized possession from his former life as a land surveyor, a large, detailed topographical map of Oakhaven County. He unrolled it carefully, the paper crinkling in the profound silence of the house. He used coffee mugs to weigh down the corners, his eyes scanning the familiar lines and symbols that represented the world he thought he knew. "Cold," he whispered to the empty room, the sound swallowed by the quiet. "Okay, Lily, what does it mean?" His mind raced, desperately trying to apply logic to a message that had come from beyond it. Cold could be a sensation. Was she near water? A basement? He let his finger trace the winding path of the Oakhaven River and its smaller tributary, Coldwater Creek. He paused. Coldwater Creek. It was a possibility. The search parties had dragged the creek a year ago, but they could have missed something. The current was tricky in places, with deep, hidden undercuts in the banks. He drew a small, hesitant circle around the name on the map. What else? He thought back to his years growing up in this town, trying to dredge up any local lore, any place associated with the word. There was Miller's Ravine, a deep gash in the earth on the north side of town. Even in the height of summer, the air at the bottom of the ravine remained unnaturally chilly, the thick canopy of trees blocking out the sun. He circled that, too. His gaze drifted to the industrial outskirts of town, a section of the map dotted with the faded symbols of defunct businesses. And then he saw it. Tucked away between the old railway line and the edge of the woods, a small, square symbol was labeled, North Star Ice and Cold Storage. The ice house. It had been abandoned for decades, a hulking, windowless brick structure that the town's teenagers used as a place for illicit parties and tests of courage. He remembered the stories they used to tell, whispers of strange noises and shadowy figures seen in the gaping, dark doorway. It was the kind of place people warned their children about, a place that held a natural, intrinsic chill long after the last block of ice had melted. North Star Ice and Cold Storage. The name itself felt like a shout amidst the whispers of other possibilities. A jolt went through him, a powerful surge of intuition that felt like absolute certainty. The swing's violent motion. The desperate whisper. It wasn't just a location, it was a prison. A cold place. He stared at the spot on the map, his heart beginning to pound a heavy, rhythmic drum against his ribs. The police had searched the area, he knew they had. But had they gone inside the derelict building? Had they truly searched every dark, forgotten corner of a place that had been sealed up since the 1970s? He doubted it. It would have been considered a waste of resources, a condemned structure too dangerous to properly explore. He pushed back from the table, his decision made. He couldn't go to Sheriff Brody, not yet. How could he explain his lead? My daughter's ghost sent me a message through a haunted swing set. They would think his grief had finally tipped him over the edge. They would send a psychiatrist, not a search party. No, this was something he had to do himself. He was the one who had received the message, and he would be the one to answer it. He moved through his house with a newfound purpose, a man on a mission. In the garage, he found his largest flashlight, a heavy, metal mag light. He checked the batteries. The beam cut a brilliant white circle against the dusty wall. He found a crowbar, its heft feeling solid and reassuring in his hand. He went back to the kitchen and grabbed a bottle of water and his EMF meter, stuffing them into an old backpack. He was acting on pure, unadulterated faith in a whisper from the void, a gamble of sanity against the slimmest sliver of hope. But it was more than he'd had in a year. Standing at his back door, he paused, looking out into the impenetrable blackness of his yard. The familiar fear was there, the icy dread of what he might find, or what he might not. But beneath it, a different feeling was kindling, a hot, burning ember of anger. Anger at whatever had taken his daughter from him, and at his own powerlessness over the past year. Tonight, he was no longer just a grieving father keeping vigil. He was a hunter. He took a deep breath, the cool night air feeling crisp and clean. He thought of Lily's laugh, of the feeling of her small hand in his. He thought of her whisper, a fragile thread thrown to him across an impossible distance. He would not let it break. He would follow it into any darkness, no matter how cold. He pulled the door open, stepped out into the night, and began the long walk toward the abandoned ice house on the edge of town. The edge of town was a different world from the manicured lawns and quiet streets of Elias's neighborhood. Here, the pavement gave way to gravel, and the houses were replaced by skeletal remains of industry. The walk took him nearly an hour, a journey from the heart of his quiet grief into a landscape of open decay. The moon was a sliver, offering little more than a dim outline to the clouds, leaving the night to the dominion of shadows. Each crunch of his boots on the loose stones of the old access road sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. The air grew colder, carrying the damp, loamy scent of the nearby woods and the metallic tang of rust. Then he saw it. The North Star Ice House didn't just appear. It materialized from the darkness, a colossal brick monolith that seemed to absorb what little light the sky offered. It was larger than he remembered, a three-story fortress of neglect. Its roof was buckled in places, looking like the broken spine of some great beast. Tall, arched windows were either boarded up with mismatched planks or gaped open like vacant eyes, revealing nothing but a deeper, more absolute blackness within. A faded sign, barely legible, still clung to the brickwork above the massive, chained-up loading bay doors. North Star Ice and Cold Storage, the coldest you can get. The slogan, once a proud boast of commercial efficiency, now felt like a sinister prophecy. Elias circled the building, his flashlight beam dancing across the graffiti-scarred walls and piles of debris. The main entrances were impenetrable, sealed with heavy chains and rusted padlocks that looked as old as the building itself. He was looking for a weakness, a way into the fortress. Around the back, where the building faced the dense woods, he found it, a small steel service door, half hidden by overgrown thorny bushes. It was dented and warped, its paint long since peeled away to reveal a cancerous spread of rust. He pulled the crowbar from his backpack. The weight of it was comforting, a solid piece of steel in a world of whispers and shadows. He wedged the flat end into the seam of the door and pushed. The metal groaned in protest, a long drawn-out shriek that echoed in the silent night. Elias froze, his heart leaping into his throat, convinced the sound would bring the whole town running. But there was only silence. He was utterly alone out here. He took a breath and pushed again, putting his whole body into it. With a final explosive crack of splintering wood and a screech of tortured metal, the lock gave way, and the door swung inward with a mournful creak. A wave of air washed over him from the opening, and he recoiled from the smell. It was an ancient, layered odor of decay, dank mildew, rotting wood, stagnant water, and something else, something vaguely organic and deeply unpleasant that he couldn't quite place. He pulled his jacket collar over his nose, clicked on his mag light, and stepped across the threshold. The flashlight beam cut a nervous, trembling tunnel through the oppressive darkness. He was in a narrow corridor that opened into a cavernous main chamber. The scale of the place was breathtaking. The ceiling was lost in the gloom high above, supported by thick iron pillars that bled rust-colored tears down to the concrete floor. Great, hulking shapes of machinery stood silent and shrouded in cobwebs, their purposes long forgotten. Rusted hooks hung from conveyor belts like metallic skeletons, and the floor was a treacherous landscape of debris, shattered glass, and deep, dark puddles of hunua. Every sound he made, the scuff of his boot, the rustle of his jacket, seemed amplified tenfold, a profane intrusion into a place that had been silent for decades. He pulled out the EMF meter and switched it on. The familiar green light flickered to life, its needle resting calmly at 0. He held his breath, sweeping the device in a slow arc around the room. Nothing. The needle didn't even twitch. A cold knot of doubt began to form in his stomach. Had he been wrong? Had his grief and desperation finally conjured a ghost that wasn't there? Was this just a fool's errand into a decaying building, led by a meaningless word born of static? He refused to give up. He had come this far. He began to walk deeper into the main chamber, his flashlight beam picking out details in the wreckage. He passed what must have been an office, its door hanging off a single hinge, a desk overturned inside, its contents spilled across the floor like entrails. He moved toward the back of the building, toward the massive, insulated doors of the cold storage vaults. They stood ajar, their thick, heavy construction designed to keep the cold in. Now, they looked like the open maws of tombs. As he approached the first vault, the EMF meter in his hand suddenly chirped. He stopped dead, his eyes glued to the device. The needle had flickered, just for a second, a brief, sharp jump into the yellow before settling back to green. It was the first sign. He wasn't crazy. He took another step, and it chirped again, louder this time. The needle trembled, dancing on the edge of the yellow zone. He was going the right way. He shone his light into the first vault. It was a vast, empty room, its walls lined with rotting wooden shelves. The air inside was noticeably colder, a pocket of the building's original purpose that had somehow lingered through the years. He stepped inside, and the EMF meter began to beep steadily, a weak but constant signal. He scanned the room, finding nothing but dust and decay. He moved to the next vault, and the next, each one colder than the last, the meters beeping growing slightly stronger with each one. He was in the last and largest of the cold storage vaults when he heard it. It wasn't a whisper. It was a sound from below his feet. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was a slow, deliberate sound. The rhythmic drag of metal on concrete. It was coming from somewhere in the foundation of the building, echoing up through the floor. Elias froze, every muscle in his body tensing. The sound was methodical, hypnotic, and utterly terrifying. It was the sound of something, or someone, patiently doing a task in the absolute blackness of the cellar. He looked down at the EMF meter. It was no longer beeping. It was screaming. A solid, high-pitched shriek as the needle shot hard into the red and stayed there, vibrating against the far end of the scale. The device was pointed at the floor, at a section of reinforced concrete in the far corner of the vault. As his flashlight beam fell upon it, he saw what he hadn't noticed before, a large, square-shaped seam in the floor, with a rusted iron ring set into its center. A trapdoor. A way down. The scraping sound from below continued its dreadful, rhythmic work, unabated. It was down there. Whatever had a hold on his daughter, whatever was keeping her trapped in the cold, was down there. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get out of this decrepit, malevolent place and never look back. But the image of Lily's face, her pigtails flying as she soared on the swing, burned brighter in his mind. The sound of her desperate, whispered plea echoed louder than the scraping from below. He knelt, his flashlight held between his teeth, and gripped the cold, rusted iron ring with both hands. His vigil was over. The hunt had led him here. With a grunt, straining every muscle, he pulled. The heavy door began to move. The iron ring was slick with rust and icy cold, biting into Elias's palms. He pulled, his muscles screaming in protest, his boots sliding on the grimy concrete. For a moment, nothing happened. The trapdoor felt as if it were fused to the floor, a permanent seal on whatever lay beneath. Then, with a deep, grinding groan of metal on stone that vibrated through the soles of his feet, it shifted. He gasped for air and pulled again, leveraging the crowbar into the seam to gain purchase. Inch by painful inch, he lifted the heavy slab of iron and concrete until it was high enough to tilt back on its protesting hinges. It slammed open against the floor with a deafening boom that echoed through the cavernous vault. The moment the door was open, two things happened simultaneously. The rhythmic scraping sound from below ceased, plunging the icehouse into a silence so profound it felt like a pressure against his eardrums. And a wave of air, a blast of pure, cryogenic cold, rushed up from the opening. It was a cold that had nothing to do with weather. It was ancient and predatory, a cold that felt like it had substance and weight. It smelled of frozen earth and something else, a faint, cloying sweetness like spoiled meat. Elias backed away from the hole, his breath pluming in front of his face in thick white clouds. The beam from his flashlight, aimed into the abyss, seemed to be swallowed by the darkness just a few feet down. He could just make out the top rungs of a narrow iron ladder, bolted to the side of the shaft, descending into nothing. This was it. This was the source. His EMF meter, which he had dropped when he heaved the door open, was still shrieking its electronic alarm from the floor beside him. He scooped it up, his hand numb from the cold, and stared into the dark. Every nerve, every primal instinct for self-preservation, told him to leave. But the thought of Lily, somewhere down in that freezing, silent dark, trapped with whatever had made that sound, was a far greater terror. He slung the backpack on, secured the crowbar, and with his flashlight gripped tight in his hand, he swung his legs over the edge and began to climb down. The ladder was slick with a thin layer of ice, and each rung was a shock of cold through his gloves. He descended blindly, the circle of his light showing nothing but the moss-covered brick of the shaft wall and the rung below his feet. The air grew colder with every foot he descended, and the oppressive silence was broken only by his own ragged breathing and the soft clink of his boots on the metal. After about 20 feet, his boots touched a solid floor. He stepped off the ladder and swept his light around him. He was in a place far older than the factory above. The walls were rough-hewn stone, not brick, and the ceiling was a low, arched vault, slick with moisture that glistened like black oil in his light. It wasn't one room, but a network of narrow, intersecting tunnels, like the catacombs of some forgotten city. The air was still and dead, the profound cold leaching the warmth from his body with alarming speed. He felt disoriented, a man trespassing in a place he was never meant to see. He held up the EMF meter. The needle was steady in the deep red, but it was no longer shrieking. Instead, it emitted a low, rhythmic pulse, like a slow heartbeat. Using it like a compass, he chose the tunnel where the pulse seemed strongest and began to walk. The floor was uneven, littered with rubble. As he moved deeper, his light picked up strange details on the walls. Scratches. Long, deep gouges in the stone, as if something with claws had raked the walls in a frenzy. But they weren't random. They formed strange, geometric patterns, spirals and sharp, angular symbols he had never seen before. It was a language of madness and pain, written into the very bones of the earth. Then he saw the piles. In small alcoves carved into the stone, almost like little shrines, were bizarre collections of objects. They were children's toys, but they were ancient, rusted things from a bygone era. A pile of metal jacks, a set of tarnished tin soldiers with their heads missing, a small, dented spinning top. They were arranged in neat, deliberate patterns, sorted by type, a curated collection of broken childhood relics. A cold dread, far deeper than the chill in the air, began to creep up Elias's spine. This wasn't a ghost. This was a lair. Something lived down here. The low hum he'd been subconsciously aware of was growing louder, and the EMF meter's pulse was quickening. He followed the tunnel as it opened into a larger chamber, and there he found the source of the cold and the sound. It was a massive freezer unit, an archaic, riveted iron box the size of a small truck, covered in a thick layer of frost that sparkled like diamonds. It was from this machine that the low, electrical hum emanated, a sign of impossible life in a mechanism that should have died 50 years ago. The energy pouring off it was immense, The meter in his hand began to shriek again, the needle straining against its stop. And there, at the base of the humming, frost-covered machine, nestled within a neat circle of headless tin soldiers, was a small splash of color. A tiny object that did not belong in this monochromatic world of rust and decay. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. He stumbled forward, his knees weak, and knelt in the freezing dust. His fingers, numb and clumsy, reached out and touched it. It was a plastic hair clip. A small, sky-blue butterfly. Lily's favorite. She had been wearing it on that last day. He picked it up, the cheap plastic a burning brand in his frozen palm. Proof. Horrible, undeniable proof. She had been here, in this dark, cold, impossible place. A sob, raw and jagged, escaped his throat. She had been physically dragged into this nightmare. The thought was a physical blow, stealing his breath and his strength. Scrape. The sound was so close, it was almost on top of him. It came from the other side of the massive freezer unit, not 10 feet away. Scrape. Drag. Instinct took over. Elias scrambled backward, killing his flashlight and flattening himself behind a low wall of fallen stones. His heart was a frantic drum, so loud he was sure it could be heard. He peered through a crack in the stones, his eyes struggling to adjust to the absolute blackness. The only light was the faint, ghostly luminescence of the frost on the great machine. Something shuffled into view from behind the freezer. It was tall, unnaturally so, and stick-thin, a being made of stretched sinew and shadow. Its limbs were too long, moving with a jerky, disjointed gait that was a parody of walking. In one of its long, spindly hands, it held a length of rusted rebar, which it was dragging methodically across the stone floor, creating the very sound that had led him here. It paid him no mind, its attention focused on the collection of toys. It knelt, its joints cracking audibly in the silence, and carefully added a small, rusted cog to one of the piles. Elias held his breath, a scream trapped in his throat. This was the thing that had taken his daughter. This collector of broken things, this haunter of the cold and the dark. He was watching a nightmare made real. The creature finished its task and stood up. The scraping stopped. For a terrible, endless moment, it stood perfectly still. Then, with a slow, unnatural motion that seemed to defy anatomy, its head, a featureless, elongated shape, began to turn. It swiveled past 90 degrees, past 180, turning directly toward the pile of stones where Elias was hiding. There was a click, a soft, wet sound from the creature, and in the profound, freezing silence of the tomb, Elias knew, with sickening certainty, that it had seen him. Time seemed to freeze in the subterranean chamber. The creature's featureless head was locked in his direction, and a sound began to emanate from it, a low, guttural clicking that vibrated in Elias's bones. It was the sound of a predator that has found its prey. Then, with a fluid, horrifying motion, it unfolded from its crouch and began to move toward him. It didn't run. It flowed across the ground, its long limbs propelling it forward with an unnatural, arachnoid grace. The rebar it had been dragging was now held like a spear, its tip glinting in the faint light from the frosted machine. Elias's paralysis shattered. A surge of pure adrenaline, born of sheer terror, flooded his system. He didn't think, he reacted. He snapped his flashlight on, aiming the powerful, concentrated beam directly at the creature's head. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The creature threw its long arms up to shield its face, letting out a high-pitched, piercing shriek that was a horrifying mix of animal rage and scraping metal. It recoiled, stumbling backward into the freezer unit with a heavy thud, momentarily blinded and disoriented. That was the only opening he was going to get. Elias scrambled to his feet and ran. He bolted from behind the stone wall, his boots slipping in the dust, and plunged back into the oppressive darkness of the tunnels. He didn't know if he was going the right way. He was just running away from the shriek that was now subsiding, replaced by an enraged, clicking fury. Behind him, he heard a crash as the creature recovered, and then the familiar, dreadful sound began again, faster this time, more frantic. Scrape, 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 scrape. It was the sound of his own death, chasing him through the guts of the earth. His flashlight beam cut a frantic, bouncing path ahead of him, revealing nothing but endless, identical stone passages. Panic clawed at his throat, cold and sharp. The tunnels were a maze, designed to confuse, to trap. The scraping was getting closer, echoing from the walls around him, making it impossible to tell exactly where it was coming from. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw a flicker of movement in the darkness, a lanky shadow detaching itself from the others, moving far faster than he could run. He ducked into a side tunnel, a narrow fissure in the rock that he had to turn sideways to squeeze through. He heard the creature's rebar clang against the opening as it was forced to slow down, its wider frame unable to pass through as easily. It gave him a few precious seconds. He pushed through the tight passage and emerged into a small, dead-end chamber, no bigger than a closet. He was trapped. He spun around, his back hitting the cold stone wall, his flashlight aimed at the opening, waiting for the inevitable. The scraping stopped right outside the fissure. A profound silence fell, thick with anticipation. He could hear a faint, wet breathing sound from just beyond the rock. His frantic light swept around his tiny prison, and for a second, his terror was eclipsed by a stunning, heart-stopping discovery. On the wall to his left, at the height a small child would stand, were scratches. But these weren't the chaotic, angular symbols he'd seen before. These were drawings. Lily's drawings. He recognized her unmistakable style instantly. The way she drew people with big, round heads and stick bodies. The way she made flowers with perfectly spaced petals. His light trembled as he traced the images carved into the stone. There was the park, with a crude but recognizable swing set. There was a little girl with pigtails, holding the hand of a very tall, very thin stick figure. And then there was the last, largest drawing, the one the stick figure was leading the little girl towards. It was a tree, but it was no ordinary tree. It was ancient and massive, its branches twisted into grotesque, arthritic shapes, and its trunk was split down the middle by a dark, gaping hollow. It was a specific, landmark tree, drawn with a detail that spoke of careful observation. A new clue. A map, scratched into the wall of his daughter's prison. A loud crack from the entrance to the chamber snapped him back to the present. The creature was forcing its way through, its unnatural limbs bending at impossible angles to fit through the narrow space. A long, three-fingered hand, pale and skeletal, scraped against the stone as it reached into the chamber. With the image of the gnarled tree burned into his mind, Elias knew he couldn't die here. He saw another fissure on the far side of the small chamber, even smaller than the one he'd entered through. Without a second thought, he threw himself at it. It was a punishingly tight squeeze, the rough stone tearing at his jacket and skin, but the fear of the hand reaching for his ankle drove him forward. He burst out into another corridor, collapsing to the floor in a heap. The creature shrieked in frustration behind him. He was on his feet again in an instant, running with a new sense of direction. He had seen the ladder on his way in, he just had to find his way back to it. He followed the tunnel, ignoring the offshoots, focusing on the memory of his path. The scraping resumed behind him, but it sounded slightly more distant now. He had gained some ground. He saw the main chamber ahead, the hulking, frosted shape of the freezer unit, a welcome, terrifying landmark. And beyond it, the blessed, beautiful silhouette of the iron ladder. He sprinted across the chamber floor, not daring to look back, his lungs burning, his legs screaming. He reached the base of the ladder and began to climb, pulling himself up the icy rungs with the last of his strength. He was halfway up when he heard a clang below. The creature had entered the chamber. He risked a look down and saw it standing at the bottom of the ladder, its featureless face tilted up towards him. It didn't try to climb. It simply lifted its arm and threw the length of rebar at him like a javelin. The metal rod flew past his head, missing him by inches, and struck the brick wall of the shaft with a shower of sparks before clattering into the darkness below. Elias didn't wait for a second attempt. He scrambled the rest of the way, his hands raw, and hauled himself over the edge, collapsing onto the concrete floor of the cold storage vault above. He crawled to the trapdoor, adrenaline his only fuel. He grabbed the edge and pulled, his body screaming with the effort. It was impossibly heavy. He could hear the creature beginning to climb the ladder, the metallic clinks echoing up the shaft. With a final, desperate roar, he heaved the door, and it slammed shut with a deafening boom. He fumbled for his crowbar, his hand shaking violently, and jammed it through the iron ring, wedging the long steel bar against the concrete floor. It was a fragile lock, but it would have to do. He didn't wait to see if it would hold. He ran. Stumbling through the main floor of the ice house, a world of shadows and ghosts, he burst through the broken service door and into the open air. The sky was no longer black, but a soft, bruised purple. The first hints of dawn were breaking on the horizon. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing in a heap in a dew-soaked field a mile away from the malevolent brick building. He lay there, gasping for air, the cold, clean scent of the morning filling his lungs. In his clenched fist, he held the small, blue butterfly clip. And in his mind, he saw a twisted, gnarled tree with a hollow in its heart. He had survived. He had a clue. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the ice house ever could, exactly where he had to go next. The sun was a searing, indifferent eye in the sky by the time Elias stumbled through his own front door. He locked and bolted it behind him, an act of pure, futile instinct, as if a simple deadbolt could keep the thing from the ice house at bay. The familiar quiet of his home, once a source of suffocating grief, now felt like a sanctuary, a fragile bubble of normalcy in a world that had been irrevocably broken. He was a creature from another reality, covered in the grime and terror of the night, an intruder in the clean, sunlit rooms of his former life. He made his way to the bathroom, his body a symphony of aches and pains. In the harsh light above the medicine cabinet, he saw his reflection and barely recognized the man looking back. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, his eyes were wide and bloodshot, haunted by visions of impossible angles and shadowy limbs. A deep, ragged scratch ran from his temple to his jaw, a physical mark left by his flight through the narrow tunnels. He looked like a madman. Maybe he was. He turned on the tap and splashed cold water on his face, the sensation a shocking, grounding anchor to reality. As he washed the grime away, he carefully opened his clenched fist. There, resting in his palm, was the small, blue butterfly hair clip. It was smudged with dirt but otherwise perfect, a tiny, fragile piece of his daughter rescued from the absolute heart of darkness. He cleaned it gently with a towel and set it on the clean, white porcelain of the sink, a sacred offering. Seeing it there, real and solid, silenced the part of his mind that was screaming this was all a nightmare. It was real. The creature, the cold, the drawings, all of it. Exhaustion, deep and profound, finally claimed him. He collapsed onto his bed without bothering to undress and fell into a sleep that was no escape at all. It was a turbulent, feverish darkness, filled with the sound of scraping metal and the image of a tall, thin figure leading a little girl by the hand towards the gaping maw of a twisted tree. He awoke with a gasp just a few hours later, the afternoon sun slanting through his window. The image from his nightmare burned fresh and vivid in his mind. He couldn't rest. Not until he knew. With a surge of renewed purpose, he went to the kitchen table and grabbed a notepad and pen. His hand, still unsteady, sketched the image from the stone wall. He drew the impossibly old tree, focusing on the details Lily had captured. The way one thick branch grew almost parallel to the ground before shooting upward, the distinct pattern of the gnarled bark, and the dark, vertical slash of the hollow in its trunk. It wasn't just a tree, it was a portrait. He knew every park and public space in Oakhaven like the back of his hand. This tree wasn't in any of them. It was wilder, older. It belonged to the deep woods that bordered the town, the state lands that stretched for miles. To find it, he needed history. He needed maps. He needed the one place in town that collected all the forgotten stories, the Oakhaven Public Library. He cleaned himself up as best he could, changing into a fresh shirt to hide the worst of his scrapes. He drove into the town center, feeling like a spy, a man harboring a terrible, secret knowledge. The library was an oasis of calm, smelling of old paper and floor polish. He nodded curtly to the librarian, a kindly older woman named Mrs. Gable, and made a beeline for the local history section in the back. It was a small, dusty alcove filled with leather-bound town records and forgotten high school yearbooks. He started with old photographs, flipping through albums of Oakhaven's founders and its long-demolished buildings, looking for a glimpse of that distinctive tree in the background of a picture. An hour yielded nothing. He moved on to the maps, tracing the town's expansion from a small settlement into its current form. He saw the North Star Ice House appear on a map from the 1920s, a cold lump forming in his stomach. But still, no sign of the tree. Frustrated, he turned to the books. Most were dry histories of the town's mayors and industries. But one thin, worn volume caught his eye. It had a simple, hand-tooled leather cover with a faded title, Hollows and Haunts of Oakhaven County. It was a collection of local folklore, compiled by a high school history teacher in the 1950s. He sat down and began to read. He scanned chapters on the ghost of the old railway line and the phantom lights of Miller's Ravine. And then he found it. A chapter titled, The Orphan Tree. He read the words, his heart pounding against his ribs. The book spoke of an old massive oak tree deep in the Oakhaven woods, on the site of the former St. Jude's Home for Children. The orphanage, the book recounted, had burned to the ground in a tragic fire in the late 1800s, claiming the lives of the headmaster and 7 children. The sole survivor of the fire was the ancient oak that stood beside the building. The legend claimed the tree had absorbed the sorrow of the tragedy, and that on quiet nights, you could hear the whispers of the lost children rustling in its leaves. Some even claimed the tree had a malevolent spirit, that it collected things that were lost in the woods, drawing them to its hollow trunk. The book included a faded, black and white photograph from the 1930s. There, unmistakable, was his tree. The same gnarled branches. The same dark, hollow scar in its trunk. Elias's blood ran cold. The creature from the ice house, the collector of broken toys. The orphan tree, the collector of lost things. The connection was undeniable. This was the center of the web. He cross-referenced the orphanage's location on an old plat map from the library's collection. The grounds were now part of the state forest, miles from any maintained road, a place left to be reclaimed by nature and forgotten by time. He gathered his notes, his mind racing. He had a location. He had a name for the darkness he was facing. He walked out of the library, blinking in the bright afternoon sun, his head swimming with folklore and fire and ghosts. He was so lost in thought that he almost bumped into a uniformed figure stepping out of the adjacent coffee shop. "Whoa there, Elias. You okay?" It was Sheriff Brody. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, his expression a mixture of surprise and immediate concern. He took in Elias's pale face, the fresh scratch, the frantic, haunted look in his eyes. "Sheriff," Elias mumbled, his voice hoarse. "I'm fine. Just working on something." "You look like you've been through a war," Brody said, his voice lowered, his professional gaze scanning Elias from head to toe. "Everything all right at home? You haven't been sleeping." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. "I'm fine," Elias repeated, more firmly this time, unable to meet the sheriff's eyes. "Just a lot on my mind. I have to go." He started to walk away, but Brody put a hand gently on his shoulder. "Elias, if you need to talk, my door is always open. Don't go trying to carry the whole world yourself, son. It'll crush you." The kindness in the sheriff's voice was almost his undoing. For a second, he was tempted to tell him everything. The swing, the whisper, the ice house, the creature. But the words died in his throat. It was the story of a madman. Brody's concern would turn to pity, and he'd be trading a lonely quest for a padded room. He shrugged off the hand. "I appreciate it, Sheriff. But I'm fine." He walked away, leaving Sheriff Brody standing on the sidewalk, watching him go with a deep, worried frown. Elias didn't look back. He drove home, the brief interaction solidifying his resolve. He was alone in this. No one else could see the world he now saw, the shadows that lay just beneath the surface of his quiet little town. Back in his house, he spread a modern topographical map of the state forest across his kitchen table. He located the area where the old orphanage had stood and marked it with a red X. It was a long, difficult hike through miles of dense, untamed wilderness. He looked at the mark, the destination for his pilgrimage into the heart of a century-old nightmare. He had faced the creature in its lair. Now, he had to go to its home. He began to pack his bag again, his movements slow and deliberate. There was no more room for hesitation, no time for the luxury of doubt. The world had presented Elias with a new and terrible set of rules, and to survive, to win, he had to play the game. He spent the rest of the day preparing, his movements precise and methodical, a stark contrast to the frantic chaos in his soul. This was not a panicked flight into the dark. This was a planned expedition into enemy territory. He emptied his old hiking backpack and started again from scratch. He packed a full canteen of water, protein bars, a compass, and a detailed topographical map of the Oak Haven State Forest, on which a single, stark red X pulsed with significance. He added a first aid kit, a coil of nylon rope, and the heavy mag light that had served him so well in the ice house. Then he considered the problem of defense. The crowbar had been a tool for entry. It was too heavy and clumsy for a fight. He was not a man of violence, but the memory of that skeletal hand reaching for him in the tunnel was a powerful motivator. In his garage, behind a stack of old tires, was his camping gear. From it, he retrieved a small hand axe, its hickory handle smooth and solid in his grip, its steel head honed to a sharp edge. It felt brutal, but necessary. He strapped it to the side of his pack. Then he remembered something else. In the emergency kit in his truck were 3 highway road flares. He thought of the creature's violent reaction to his flashlight, its screech of pain and rage. Bright light was a weapon. He took all 3. Finally, he went to the bathroom sink and retrieved the blue butterfly hair clip. He carefully placed it in his shirt pocket, the one over his heart. It was a shield, a compass, a reason. He set his alarm for 4 a.m. Before the first hint of dawn, while Oak Haven still slept, he was in his truck, driving through the silent streets. He left the town behind, following the county road as it dwindled from smooth asphalt to cracked pavement, and finally to a gravel track that ended abruptly at a rusted metal gate marking the entrance to the state forest. This was as far as civilization went. He parked the truck, killed the engine, and stepped out into the cool pre-dawn air. The silence here was different from the silence of his house. It was alive, a vast, breathing quiet filled with the whisper of wind in the pines and the distant call of a hunting owl. He shouldered his pack, took a deep breath, and walked around the gate, disappearing into the wall of trees. The first hour of the hike was deceptively peaceful. He followed a barely there trail marked for deer, the ground soft with pine needles under his boots. But as the sun rose, casting long, distorted shadows through the trees, the character of the woods began to change. The forest grew thicker, the trees older and more densely packed, their branches interlocking high above to form a dense canopy that blocked out the sky. The light that filtered through was green and murky, like the light at the bottom of a lake. The air grew still and heavy, and the normal sounds of the forest, the chatter of squirrels, the songs of birds, faded away, leaving behind an unnerving, watchful silence. Elias relied on his old skills, his eyes constantly flicking between the compass in his hand and the topographical lines on his map. He was a surveyor again, charting a course through a hostile landscape. The terrain fought him at every step. What looked like a gentle slope on the map would turn out to be a steep, treacherous ravine choked with thorns. A clear path would end abruptly in an impenetrable wall of undergrowth, forcing him to backtrack and find another way. It felt as if the woods themselves were actively trying to turn him around, to keep him from his destination. After nearly 3 hours of grueling hiking, he saw the first sign. Carved into the bark of a massive beech tree was a familiar, sharp, angular symbol. It was the same alien geometry he had seen on the stone walls beneath the ice house. His blood ran cold. He was on the right path. He was entering its domain. From that point on, the signs became more frequent. Another symbol on a moss-covered boulder. Then he saw a pile of stones, arranged in a neat, unsettling spiral on the forest floor. A little further on, a collection of broken robin's eggs, their brilliant blue shells laid out in a perfect circle. The creature's strange, ritualistic behavior, its obsession with collecting and arranging, was not confined to the ice house. This entire forest was its lair. The temperature began to drop. It was a subtle change at first, but it soon became a palpable, unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the shade of the canopy. His breath began to mist in the air. He knew he was getting close. He checked his map one last time. The location of the St. Jude's Home for Children was just beyond the next ridge. He pushed his way through a final, thick wall of ferns and stepped out of the oppressive darkness of the trees. He was standing at the edge of a large, circular clearing. And he was not alone. The ruins of the orphanage were just as the book had described, a crumbling foundation of fieldstone, choked with ivy, and the skeletal remains of a great stone chimney, reaching toward the sky like a lonely, accusing finger. The sense of sorrow in the clearing was a physical weight, a century of tragedy soaked into the very soil. And in the center of it all, dominating the landscape, was the orphan tree. The photograph, his memory, Lily's drawing, none of them had done it justice. It was a monster of nature, a living testament to time and tragedy. It was impossibly huge, its trunk wider than his truck was long, its bark a thick, gnarled hide of deep fissures and cancerous-looking burls. Its massive branches, bare of leaves despite the season, twisted toward the gray sky like the arthritic arms of a dying giant. And there, in the center of the trunk, was the hollow. It was a vertical slash of absolute blackness, a wound in the heart of the ancient wood, a doorway to nothing. Elias walked slowly into the clearing, his boots silent on the mossy ground. The air was deathly still and freezing cold. He unslung his pack, his hand going to the hatchet strapped to its side. He pulled out the EMF meter. The moment he switched it on, it let out a deafening, solid shriek, the needle instantly slamming into the far side of the red zone. The energy pouring out of the tree was off the scale, a silent, invisible storm of supernatural power. He approached the tree as if it were a living, breathing beast. He stood before the hollow, which was tall enough for him to walk into without ducking. The darkness within was complete, an oily black that seemed to absorb the light around it. He took the mag light from his pack, but hesitated to turn it on, the memory of the creature's reaction holding him back. He stood there, on the precipice of the unknown, his heart hammering against his ribs. What had he expected? To find Lily waiting for him inside? To find the creature and end this? Then, from the absolute blackness of the hollow, a sound emerged. It was not a screech or a click or a scrape. It was a whisper, a soft, perfectly clear, and achingly familiar voice. It was Lily's voice, but it was different somehow, older, calmer, devoid of any fear. It was a sound he had longed to hear for a year, a sound that now filled him with a dread colder than any winter's night. The voice spoke a single word, a gentle, beckoning summons from the heart of the darkness. The voice was a perfect imitation, a flawless echo of a sound he cherished more than his own life. It wrapped around him, a siren song promising the end of his year-long agony. For a single, breathtaking moment, Elias allowed himself to believe. Hope, wild and brilliant, flared in his chest. "Lily!" he breathed, taking a step toward the consuming darkness of the hollow. His rational mind, still screaming the lessons learned in the ice house, was drowned out by the desperate, primal cry of a father's heart. Trap or not, it didn't matter. He would walk into any darkness that held the faintest whisper of his daughter. With his hand gripping the handle of the hand axe, he stepped across the threshold of the orphan tree. The transition was instantaneous and utterly disorienting. There was no sensation of movement, no feeling of passing through wood. One moment he was in the cold, sun-dappled clearing, the next he was somewhere else. The entrance did not close behind him, it simply ceased to exist. He was standing in a place of profound and unending twilight. There was no sun, no moon, no visible source of light, yet a soft, uniform gray illumination suffused the space, casting no shadows. The air was perfectly still, silent, and cold, carrying a scent of dry dust and ozone. He looked down. The ground beneath his feet was a soft, dark soil, packed down as if by centuries of slow, patient pressure. He looked up and saw no sky, only a swirling, nebulous ceiling of gray mist that seemed to stretch into infinity. He had stepped out of the world. He was inside the collection. He took a few tentative steps forward, his boots making no sound on the strange ground. As his eyes adjusted, he began to see the landscape for what it was. It was a vast, silent museum of the lost. Everywhere he looked, scattered across the dusky plain, were objects. A rusted child's tricycle from a bygone decade lay on its side, one wheel spinning slowly in a non-existent breeze. A few yards away, a single, elegant lady's glove made of fine leather, stained and cracked with age. He saw piles of tarnished silver keys, a scattering of bone-handled pocket knives, a rotary telephone, a modern smartphone with a spiderweb crack across its screen. It was a graveyard of forgotten things, a testament to 150 years of carelessness, loss, and sorrow, all meticulously gathered and laid to rest in this timeless vault. He began to walk, then to run, his head whipping back and forth, frantically scanning the surreal landscape. He called her name, his voice sounding flat and dead in the echoless space. Lily! The only answer was the profound, crushing silence. He ran past a perfectly preserved wooden rocking horse, its painted eyes staring blankly into the grayness. He ran past a collection of old glass milk bottles, arranged in a neat, straight line. He was in the creature's hoard, the physical manifestation of its obsession. And then he saw her. In the distance, a small figure sat on the dark ground, her back to him. She was wearing the same pink jacket and jeans she had on the day she disappeared. Elias's heart seized in his chest, a painful, constricting knot of relief and terror. He slowed to a walk, his legs trembling, not wanting to frighten her. "Lily," he said, his voice a choked whisper. The small figure didn't move. She was focused on something in her hands. As he got closer, he saw that she was playing with the same headless tin soldiers he had seen at the base of the freezer in the ice house, arranging them in a careful, deliberate circle. "Lily, honey, it's Daddy." She looked up, turning her head slowly. It was her face, her beautiful, perfect face. But her eyes were different. The bright, mischievous spark he loved was gone, replaced by a calm, placid emptiness. There was a flicker of recognition, but it was muted, as if she were seeing him through a thick pane of glass. "Daddy," she said, her voice soft and even, showing no surprise, no joy, no fear. "You came." Tears streamed down Elias's face. He rushed forward and fell to his knees in front of her, pulling her into a fierce, desperate hug. She felt real, solid in his arms, but she was stiff, unyielding. She did not hug him back. He pulled away, holding her by the shoulders. "Lily, I'm here now. I'm going to take you home. Everything is going to be okay." She looked at him with a placid, slightly confused expression. "But I am home," she said, her gaze drifting around the gray, timeless space. "It's quiet here. He keeps us safe." "He?" Elias asked, his blood turning to ice. "Who, baby? Who keeps you safe?" "The tall man," she answered simply, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "He looks after the lost things. He brought me here from the noise. He said I was special, the prize of his collection." The words struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. This was a horror beyond anything he had imagined. The creature hadn't just stolen his daughter, it had converted her. It had twisted her fear and loneliness into a strange, Stockholm-like affection. It had offered her a twisted sanctuary, and a part of her had accepted. As if summoned by his name, a figure began to coalesce from the gray mist about 50 feet away. The tall man. It emerged from the twilight not with a sudden jump, but with a slow, deliberate fade into being, like a photograph developing. It stood there, impossibly tall and thin, its featureless face turned toward them. It held no rebar, no weapon. It was simply present, a silent, unmovable warden of its domain. It was not immediately hostile. Its posture was one of patient, absolute ownership. Elias got to his feet, gently pulling Lily behind him, placing himself between his daughter and the monster. The child did not resist, but she did not cling to him either. She simply watched, her expression unreadable. "She's my daughter," Elias said, his voice shaking but laced with a new, cold fury. "You can't have her." The creature made no sound. It simply took a single, slow, deliberate step forward. "Lily," Elias said, his voice low and urgent, never taking his eyes off the approaching figure. "You have to come with me. Now. We are going home." Lily looked from the silent, advancing creature to her desperate, terrified father. Her face was a mask of confusion, her mind caught in the grip of an impossible choice. The tall man let out a low, guttural clicking sound, a soft warning, a gentle assertion of its claim. And Lily, standing between the father who had lost her and the monster who had found her, did not move. The creature's low, possessive click was a declaration of war. Elias stood his ground, his arm protectively keeping Lily behind him. He knew, with a father's gut certainty, that he could not win this with the axe. The tall man was not a thing of flesh and bone to be chopped or broken. It was an idea, a force of cold, silent possession. He couldn't fight the monster without first saving his daughter from the sanctuary it had built in her mind. He had to remind her of the warmth, of the noise the creature had stolen her from. He had to fight for her soul with the only weapon that could ever matter, their life together. He ignored the tall man, letting his gaze soften as he focused entirely on Lily. "Hey, sweet pea," he began, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the frantic pounding of his heart. "Remember Saturday mornings? Remember the smell of the pancakes I'd make? The special ones with the chocolate chip smiley faces? You'd always eat the eyes first." Lily's vacant expression flickered. A tiny V-shape of confusion appeared between her eyebrows. The tall man took another slow, deliberate step, its head tilting slightly, as if trying to decipher the strange, warm sounds Elias was making. "And remember our song?" Elias continued, his voice growing stronger. "The one we'd sing before bed, when you were scared of the monsters under your bed?" He began to hum, then to sing softly, the familiar words of prayer in the dead, gray air. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray." At the sound of the song, Lily flinched. She put her hands to her ears, her placid calm shattering. "Stop," she whispered. "It's too loud." The creature let out a sharp, angry hiss, a sound like steam escaping a cracked boiler. It recognized the threat. Memory was poison in this place. Love was a language it could not speak, and it hated the sound of it. Elias pressed his advantage, his words coming faster now, a torrent of love and life aimed at breaking the spell. "You remember the park, Lilybug. Your swing. You'd pump your legs so hard, trying to touch the leaves on the big oak tree. You'd laugh so loud, that bright, beautiful sound. Remember the feeling of flying, honey? The sun on your face, the wind in your hair." He took a step toward her, reaching into his shirt pocket. He knelt down, so he was on her level. The tall man loomed just a few yards away now, its long, spindly fingers twitching, its silent menace growing with every word Elias spoke. "You wore this," Elias said, his voice thick with tears. He opened his palm. Resting there, vibrant and impossibly real in the colorless world, was the blue butterfly hair clip. "You wore this in your hair. A little piece of blue sky. Remember, Lily? Remember the sky." Lily stared at the small plastic clip. Her hand, trembling, reached out and brushed her fingertips against it. The moment she touched it, something broke. A great, shuddering sob escaped her lips. The placid emptiness in her eyes washed away in a flood of real hot tears. Her face crumpled into the familiar expression of a lost and terrified little girl. She looked up at him, her eyes her own again, and whispered the words that had started it all, the words that had crossed the veil to find him at the park. "Daddy," she cried, her voice cracking. "I'm so cold." The change was instantaneous. The moment the spell was broken, the moment Lily was truly his again, the tall man ceased to be a passive guardian. With a shriek that tore through the silence, a sound of pure, thwarted rage, it lunged. Its long limbs unfolded, its shadowy form rocketing across the space between them with impossible speed, its three-fingered hands reaching for the child it considered its own. But Elias was ready. He had been waiting for this. While its attention was on Lily, he had already shrugged his pack to the ground and ripped open the main flap. As the creature launched its attack, his hand closed around the familiar, cylindrical shape of a road flare. In one fluid motion, he pulled it free, twisted the cap, and struck the igniter against the rough patch. The flare erupted with a blinding, violent hiss. A furious, brilliant geyser of red light and white-hot magnesium sparks exploded into the gray, twilight world. The effect on the creature was catastrophic. It was like dousing a thing of pure shadow with concentrated sunlight. The tall man screamed, a sound that was no longer a hiss or a click but a high-frequency wail of absolute agony. It recoiled violently, its shadowy form seeming to smoke and dissolve where the harsh light touched it, its long arms flailing to shield its featureless face from the unbearable glare. The flare fell to the dusty ground, casting the entire bizarre landscape in a flickering, demonic red light and dancing, distorted shadows. It was the noise and the light of the world Lily had been taken from, and it was a weapon of awesome power here. "Hold on tight," Elias yelled over the creature's screams. He scooped Lily into his arms. She wasn't stiff or resistant now. She clung to him with a desperate strength, burying her face in his neck, sobbing his name over and over. He held her tight, the feeling of her small, trembling body against his the only thing that mattered in the universe. He turned his back on the writhing, screeching creature and the burning flare. He did the only thing he could do. He ran. He plunged into the endless gray twilight, with his daughter in his arms and no destination in sight. Behind them, the agonized shrieks of the tall man echoed through the silent, timeless world, a promise that though it was wounded, it was not dead, and it would not give up its prize so easily. They were free from its grasp, but they were still trapped in its collection, and there was no exit in sight. Elias ran until his lungs burned and his legs felt like lead. He held Lily tight against his chest, her small, sobbing breaths a painful, beautiful rhythm against his own ragged gasps. The endless, gray landscape offered no landmarks, no sense of distance or direction. He was simply running away from the dying red glow of the flare and the fading, agonized shrieks of the wounded creature. He pushed himself onward, driven by the primal need to put as much space as possible between his daughter and the monster that had claimed her. Finally, his legs buckled. He stumbled and fell to his knees, carefully shielding Lily from the impact. He had to stop. He had to think. He scanned the surreal junkyard around them. A short distance away loomed the skeletal remains of an old city bus, its windows long gone, its tires melted into the dusty ground. It was a flimsy shelter, but it was something. "Come on, sweet pea," he whispered, getting to his feet. "Let's rest for a minute." He carried her into the hollowed-out shell of the bus and sank onto one of the rusted metal seats. He gently set Lily down beside him, never letting go of her hand. The red glow of the flare was gone now, plunging the world back into its perpetual, shadowless twilight. The creature's screams had faded into a ringing silence. For the moment, they were safe. Lily had stopped crying, but she was trembling violently, her eyes wide with the accumulated terror of her ordeal. He pulled her into his lap, wrapping his arms around her, trying to pour all the warmth and love he possessed into her small, cold frame. "It's okay, Lilybug," he murmured, stroking her hair. "Daddy's here. It's okay. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." They sat in silence for a long time, the only reality in the universe, the feeling of his daughter's heart beating against his. Slowly, her trembling subsided. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and present, but haunted. "He put me away, Daddy," she whispered, her voice small. "He said the world was too loud and too bright. He said I was a special thing that needed to be kept safe and quiet, like his toys." "Did he hurt you?" Elias asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Lily shook her head. "No. He was quiet. He would bring me things. Broken things. He would hum. It was a sad sound. He told me this place was forever, so nothing could ever break again." Elias's heart ached. The creature hadn't been a jailer in the traditional sense. It had been a curator. A monstrous, deluded thing that saw his vibrant, living daughter as just another broken toy to be preserved in its cold, silent collection. "Lily," he said, his voice gentle, "did he ever talk about leaving? A way out of this place?" She frowned, thinking hard. He said it was sealed. He said the only time the door opens is when a memory is strong enough to touch the outside world. He called it an echo. A memory. An echo. Elias's mind seized on the words. That's what her whisper at the park had been. An echo of her, strong enough to break through the veil. And the flare. The flare had been a violent, chaotic burst of energy, of change, in this place of absolute stasis. It was the antithesis of everything this world was. That's why it had hurt the creature so badly. They couldn't fight their way out, but maybe, just maybe, they could think their way out. "He's right, Lily," Elias said, a desperate idea taking root in his mind. "A memory is the key. We just need to find the right one. A memory of a place that's in between. A place that touches both worlds." He thought of his house, of Lily's school, but dismissed them. They were too solid, too grounded in reality. They needed something else. A place of transition. Then it hit him with the force of a physical blow. The swing set. The swing set at Dusk. It was the place where she was taken, a moment where the world had blurred and the tall man had reached through. It was the place where her echo had reached him, a bridge built of love and grief. It was the epicenter of everything. Scrape. The sound was distant, but unmistakable. Faint, but growing steadily louder. Scrape. Drag. Elias's blood ran cold. The creature was hunting them. Its rage had overcome its pain. He looked at Lily, her face pale with renewed fear. They had no time. Lily, listen to me, he said, his voice low and urgent. We have to go back to the park. Not with our feet, but with our minds. You and me, together. We have to create an echo so strong it will tear a hole in this place. Can you do that? Can you help me remember? She looked terrified, the memory of that last day in the park a source of trauma. But that's where the tall man got me, she whispered. I know, Elias said, gripping her small hands in his. But that's why it's the right place. It's our place, not his. He just borrowed it. We're going to take it back. I need you to be brave for me, sweet pea. Close your eyes. Don't think about the gray place. Don't listen to the scraping. Just think about the swing. The scraping was closer now. A slow, rhythmic, limping sound. The sound of a wounded predator, dragging itself forward, relentless. Elias pulled Lily tight against him, shielding her body with his own. Close your eyes, honey. Now, he commanded, his own eyes shutting tight. Picture it. The big oak tree. The sun is going down. You can feel the cool evening air. You're on your favorite swing, the one on the right. I'm right behind you, ready to push. Can you see it, Lily? Can you see the empty swing set at dusk? He felt her nod against his chest. Outside the rusted shell of the bus, the scraping sound grew louder, closer, a dreadful metronome counting down their final seconds in the gray, silent world. The scraping was a predator's slow, confident approach. It was the sound of inevitable discovery. Huddled in the cold, dark shell of the bus, Elias held his daughter and shut out the world. He focused, pushing past the terror, past the exhaustion, and into the sun-drenched memory of a perfect afternoon. He didn't just remember it, he willed it into being. He felt the familiar weight of the swing chains in his hands. He felt the warmth of the setting sun on the back of his neck. He smelled the sweet scent of freshly cut grass and the faint, earthy aroma of the great oak tree. I'm right behind you, Lilybug, he whispered, his eyes squeezed shut. You're kicking your legs, trying to go higher. You're laughing. I can hear your laugh, sweet pea. It's the best sound in the whole world. Beside him, Lily was doing the same. She let go of the gray, cold reality and fell into the warm, safe cocoon of the past. She wasn't a lost girl in a terrible place. She was a little girl on a swing. She felt the smooth, worn plastic of the seat beneath her. She felt the giddy, weightless sensation in her stomach as she soared upwards, her pigtails flying behind her. She could see the world spread out below her feet, the green grass, the red wood chips, her father's smiling face as she flew back toward him. The memory was so powerful, so real, it began to bleed into the world around them. The oppressive, dusty smell of the bus began to fade, replaced by the scent of a summer evening in Illinois. The profound silence was broken by the gentle, hypnotic chirp of crickets. And the dim, shadowless twilight began to warm, tinged at the edges with the impossible, brilliant orange and gold of a setting sun. The gray world was starting to give way, overwritten by the sheer, concentrated power of their shared love. Screech. A sound of tearing metal ripped through the nascent memory. The creature was here. Elias's eyes flew open. A long skeletal hand, blacker than the gray mist, had punched through the rusted roof of the bus and was now clawing at the opening, trying to rip it wider. The scraping had stopped. The hunt was over. The creature was filled with a frantic, desperate rage, sensing its prize was about to vanish. Don't stop, Lily, Elias yelled, pulling her tighter. Hold on to the memory. Harder. We're almost there. Swing higher. He shut his eyes again, forcing his mind back to the park, even as the bus shuddered and groaned under the creature's assault. He poured every ounce of his will, his grief, his love, and his desperation into the memory. He wasn't just pushing Lily on the swing anymore. He was pushing her towards the sky, towards safety, towards home. Lily, hearing the terror in her father's voice, did as he said. She squeezed her eyes shut so tightly she saw stars. In her mind, she was no longer just swinging, she was flying. Higher and higher, so high the chains groaned, so high she could almost touch the branches of the oak tree. The feeling of pure, unadulterated joy, the perfect pinnacle of a childhood memory, became a beacon, a lighthouse in the gray, timeless sea. At that moment, as their shared memory reached its crescendo, the metal wall at the back of the bus began to shimmer. It wavered like a heat haze on a summer road, the rusted metal turning translucent. The gray landscape behind it dissolved, replaced by a perfect, living image of the Oakhaven Town Park at dusk. They could see the great oak tree, the slide, the monkey bars, and the swing set, its chains glinting in the last rays of the sun. The portal was open. With a final deafening shriek of tortured metal, the creature ripped a hole in the side of the bus large enough to enter. Its tall, emaciated form flowed through the opening, its featureless face contorted with a silent, consuming rage. "Go, Lily! Now!" Elias roared. He shoved his daughter toward the shimmering portal. Lily stumbled, then scrambled through, disappearing from the gray world and into the golden light of home. Elias turned to follow, but a hand, cold as the grave and strong as steel, clamped down on his ankle. He was jerked backward, falling hard onto the floor of the bus. The creature loomed over him, its other hand reaching down for him, to drag him back into the silent darkness, to make him a permanent part of its collection. He had one last chance. With his free hand, he fumbled in his backpack, his fingers closing around the last road flare. He didn't have time to light it and throw it. He had to do something more. As the creature leaned down, he jammed the unlit end of the flare deep into the smoky, indistinct mass of its torso. The creature paused, confused by the unfamiliar object. That was all the time Elias needed. He pulled the cap from the flare, and with his thumb, struck the igniter. There was no sound. There was only light. An immense, silent, internal detonation of pure, white-hot magnesium fire erupted from within the creature's core. Its shadowy form, unable to contain the violent, chaotic energy, was annihilated from the inside out. For a split second, it became a being of pure, brilliant light, and then, with a silent implosion, it was simply gone. The hand on Elias's ankle vanished into nothingness. He scrambled backward, away from the spot where the monster had been, and threw himself headfirst through the shimmering portal. He felt a wrenching, disorienting sensation, and then the blessed, solid impact of soft grass beneath him. He lay there, gasping, for a long moment. He was on his stomach, his face pressed into the cool, damp earth. He could smell the grass. He could feel a gentle evening breeze on his skin. He pushed himself up. He was in the Oakhaven Town Park. The sun had just slipped below the horizon, and the sky was a canvas of deep purple and fading orange. Standing a few feet away, trembling and crying, was Lily. And before them, its red plastic seat swaying ever so slightly in the breeze, was the swing set. The swing on the right, Lily's swing, was now perfectly, blessedly still. The portal was gone. The gray world was gone. The scraping and the silence were gone. He crawled to his daughter and pulled her into his arms, and they huddled together on the grass beneath the empty swings. They were home. They were safe. The long vigil was finally over. For a long time, they did not move. They knelt on the cool, damp grass of the real world, wrapped in a desperate, clinging embrace. The only sounds were their own ragged breaths and Lily's soft, exhausted sobs. The world, which had been absent for so long, began to flood back in, a symphony of the ordinary. A car rumbled down a nearby street. A dog barked in a neighboring yard. The distant, cheerful clang of a pan came from an open kitchen window. Each mundane sound was a miracle, a confirmation that they had truly returned. The air smelled of grass, of damp earth, and of the faint, sweet scent of honeysuckle from a nearby trellis, a smell Elias thought he might never experience again. He pulled back, his hands framing Lily's face. He checked her for injuries, his eyes scanning every inch of her. She was thinner than he remembered, and paler, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of a deep, soul-level exhaustion. But she was solid. She was warm. She was real. The pink jacket she wore was smudged with the gray dust of that other place, a single, tangible reminder of the nightmare they had escaped. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice thick. She shook her head, her eyes, which were finally her own again, never leaving his face. "I want to go home, Daddy," she whispered. "I just want to go home." "I know, sweet pea," he said, his voice cracking. "We're going home." Headlights swept across the park, and a vehicle slowed to a stop on the street. A car door opened and closed. Elias's body tensed, his protective instincts flaring, but he didn't need them. The figure walking toward them across the grass, his silhouette backlit by the patrol car's lights, was a familiar one. It was Sheriff Brody. Brody stopped about 20 feet away, as if approaching a phantom. His flashlight beam cut through the twilight, falling first on Elias, bruised and disheveled, and then on the small child clinging to him. The sheriff's jaw went slack. The flashlight wavered in his hand. He had seen Elias keeping this vigil for a year. He knew what he was looking at, but his mind refused to accept it. "Elias." Brody's voice was a strained, disbelieving whisper. He took another step forward, his light fully illuminating Lily's face. "My God, he breathed. Lily! Elias got to his feet, pulling his daughter up with him. It's her, Sheriff. It's Lily. I found her. Brody closed the distance in 3 long strides. He knelt in front of Lily, his tough, weathered face crumbling with emotion. He was a lawman, but he was also a father himself, and he had been there the night Lily had vanished. He had led the search. Her loss was a wound the whole town shared. To see her standing here, alive, was to witness the impossible. Where? How? Brody stammered, looking up at Elias, his mind struggling to find a framework for this miracle. Elias knew this was the moment. The story he told now would be the one that settled over the facts, a blanket of plausible reality to cover an impossible truth. His mind raced, pulling pieces from the ordeal and weaving them into a shape the world could understand. I got a lead, Elias said, his voice steady, practiced. A whisper. It led me to the old ice house. He was there. A man. A recluse. The kind of person who falls through the cracks. He was living there, in the tunnels underneath. He gestured to his own bruised face. He didn't want to let her go. We fought. I got her away from him. Where is he now? Brody asked, his voice instantly shifting into professional mode. Is he still at the ice house? He's gone, Elias said, the statement feeling truer than the sheriff could possibly know. He won't be bothering anyone ever again. He let the ambiguity hang in the air, allowing Brody to draw his own conclusions. A kidnapper, a struggle, a father's desperation. It was a story as old as time. Brody stood up, his gaze filled with a million questions, but he pushed them aside. He saw the state Elias was in, the shell-shocked look on Lily's face. The how could wait. The why could wait. He pulled out his radio, his hand trembling slightly. Dispatch, this is Brody. You're not going to believe this. Call off the bolo on Lily Thorne. I've got her. She's alive. The radio crackled with a stunned silence before a disbelieving voice asked him to repeat. Brody did, his own voice thick with unshed tears. He turned back to Elias. We need to get you both to the hospital. Get you checked out. No, Elias said firmly. No hospital. Not tonight. We just need to go home. Please, Bill. Just take us home. The sheriff looked at the fierce, protective fire in Elias's eyes and the way Lily clung to her father's leg as if he were the only solid thing in the universe. He made a decision. All right, Elias. Let's get you home. The ride in the patrol car was surreal. Lily sat pressed against Elias in the back seat, her face glued to the window, watching the familiar streets of Oakhaven pass by as if it were a foreign country. The streetlights, the houses with their warm, glowing windows, the other cars. It was all a part of the loud, bright world she had been taken from, and it was overwhelming. Brody drove in a respectful silence, occasionally glancing at them in the rearview mirror, his face a mixture of awe and profound relief. When they pulled up to their small house on the dead-end street, it looked exactly the same, a silent, waiting vessel. I'll have to get a full statement tomorrow, Brody said softly as Elias and Lily got out. The press is going to be all over this. I'll do my best to keep them away. You two just be with each other. I'll be in touch. Elias nodded, his gratitude too deep for words. Thank you, Bill. He unlocked the front door and pushed it open. He flicked on the light. The house came to life, exactly as they had left it a lifetime ago. Lily's pink rain boots were still by the door. Her drawings were still on the refrigerator. The half-finished puzzle was still on the coffee table. For a year, this house had been a monument to what was lost. Tonight, it became a home again. Lily stepped inside, her eyes wide as she took in her own life, perfectly preserved. She walked from the living room to the kitchen, her small fingers gently touching the familiar objects. Elias followed her, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. Later, after a warm bath and a small meal she could barely touch, Elias led her upstairs to her bedroom. He pulled back the covers on her bed, the pink comforter faded but clean. She climbed in, looking impossibly small in the bed she had been absent from for so long. He sat on the edge of the bed, just as he had done every night of her life before she was taken. Do you want me to sing our song? He asked softly. She nodded, her eyelids already growing heavy. He began to sing, his voice quiet and a little hoarse, but filled with a love that had crossed worlds to find her. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. Halfway through the second verse, she was asleep. A real, safe, peaceful sleep in her own bed. He didn't stop singing. He finished the song, then sat there in the quiet darkness, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. The vigil was over. The hunt was done. The monster was gone. He was a father again. He was home. and he knew he would sit there, watching over her, until the sun came up. Dawn arrived not as a gentle promise, but as a quiet, momentous event. Elias had not slept. He had spent the entire night in a chair beside Lily's bed, a silent, unmoving guardian. He watched the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing, a sight more precious to him than any sunrise. Each breath was a victory, a testament to their survival. When the first gray light of morning filtered through her window, it felt like the first day of a new world. He was exhausted down to his very bones, but it was a good exhaustion, an exhaustion born of a completed mission, not a hopeless vigil. Quietly, he left her room and went downstairs. The house was still, holding the fragile peace of the early morning. In the kitchen, he opened the pantry and on autopilot, took out the box of pancake mix. He moved with a sense of reverence, performing the simple, domestic ritual as if it were a sacred ceremony. He measured the flour, cracked the eggs, whisked the batter. He remembered the memory he had clung to in that gray place, the smell of pancakes, the chocolate chip smiley faces. He was not just making breakfast, he was reclaiming his life. He was making a memory reel again. A small sound from the doorway made him turn. Lily stood there, wrapped in a blanket, her bare feet silent on the linoleum. She looked at him, her eyes still holding the shadows of the place she'd been, but a new light was beginning to dawn in them as well. "Is that for me?" she asked, her voice a sleepy whisper. "Always," he said, his own voice thick. "Saturday morning pancakes. Even if it's a Monday." He was placing the first pancake on the hot griddle when he accidentally knocked a metal spatula off the counter. It hit the floor with a loud, jarring clatter. Lily flinched violently, a small cry escaping her lips as she covered her ears, her whole body tensing as if expecting a blow. Elias's heart broke. He rushed to her side, kneeling and pulling her into a hug. "It's okay, sweet pea. It's okay. Just a noise," he soothed. "The world is full of noises here. Good noises. Bad noises. But they can't hurt you. I won't let them." She relaxed slowly in his arms, but the incident was a stark reminder. She had spent a year in a place of absolute silence, a world designed to preserve and numb. The chaotic, vibrant, noisy reality of home was now a foreign country she would have to learn to navigate all over again. The scars of her captivity were not just on her memory, they were in her very nerves. They were just finishing their breakfast when a knock came at the door. It was Sheriff Brody, his face etched with concern and a distinct lack of sleep. He held his hat in his hands, looking apologetic. "Morning, Elias." "Lily," he said softly. "I hate to bother you, I truly do. But I have to ask a few more questions. We need a formal statement." Elias sat Lily on the couch with a book and led Brody to the kitchen table. "Bill, I told you what happened. And I appreciate that," Brody said, his voice low. "But you have to understand my position. I sent a forensics team and 2 deputies out to the ice house at first light. They've been all over that place, top to bottom. Especially the cellar." He paused, looking Elias straight in the eye. "They found nothing, Elias. No sign of a struggle. No clothes, no food wrappers, no body. No evidence that anyone has lived down there for 50 years. It was empty." Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach, but he kept his expression neutral. He was smart. He knew how to hide. "I told you, he was the kind of man who falls through the cracks." "A ghost, then?" Brody asked, a hint of frustration in his tone. "Because that's the only way to explain what my deputies found. Or didn't find. I need something to put in this report, son. A description. A name. Anything." "I can't give you one," Elias said, his voice hard with a resolve Brody couldn't possibly understand. "It was dark. It was fast. My only concern was getting my daughter out of there. I don't care about him. I don't care about your report. I just care about her. As far as I'm concerned, the case is closed. Lily is home. That's the end of the story." Sheriff Brody stared at him for a long, hard moment. He saw the unyielding stubbornness in Elias's eyes, the deep, dark trauma that he was fiercely protecting. He knew there was more to the story, a piece of the puzzle so strange or so terrible that Elias would never speak of it. And looking at the pale, quiet girl in the next room, Brody decided, against his professional judgment, to let it go. For now. "All right, Elias," he sighed, putting his hat back on. "She's home. That's the important thing. But you need to prepare yourself. The story is out. The media is on its way." Brody's words were an understatement. As the sheriff's patrol car pulled away, the first news van was already turning onto their quiet, dead-end street. Within an hour, their small patch of the world had become a chaotic circus. News vans with satellite dishes sprouting from their roofs lined the curb. Reporters with microphones and cameras trampled the lawn, all of them shouting questions, their lenses aimed at the house like weapons. Elias drew every curtain, locking the doors and turning the house into a fortress. He found Lily hiding in her closet, her hands over her ears, trembling from the noise. He picked her up and held her, his heart filling with a cold, protective fury. "It's okay," he said, sitting with her on the floor of the closet, the familiar smell of her old clothes surrounding them. "They're just people who want to know our story. But they can't have it. Not the real one." She looked up at him, confused. "The real story? About the tall man?" "Yes," he said softly. "That's our secret. A story just for you and me, because no one else would understand. To everyone else, we'll tell them the other story. About the bad man in the woods. It's a sad story, but it's one they can understand. It will keep us safe. Can you do that for me? Can you keep our secret?" She nodded, a silent, solemn pact passing between them. They were the only two people on Earth who knew what had really happened in the cold, gray place. It was a terrible knowledge, but it was theirs, and it bound them together. Later that afternoon, as the chaos outside showed no signs of abating, Lily sat on the living room floor, carefully reorganizing the pieces of her half-finished puzzle. Elias watched her, his heart aching with love. She looked up at him, and for the first time since her return, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. "I'm glad it's loud here, Daddy," she said quietly. "It's a happy sound." Elias felt tears well in his eyes. He went to the window and peered through a crack in the curtains at the media encampment. He had his daughter back. He had won. But he knew, with a weary certainty, that the fight was far from over. He had escaped the monster's world, but now he had to find a way to protect his daughter from his own. The first 3 days were a siege. Their small house, once a sanctuary, became a cage. The world Elias had fought so hard to return his daughter to was now laying claim to their story, its relentless curiosity a tangible pressure against their walls and windows. The constant presence of the news vans was a low-grade fever, draining the peace from every room. Muffled voices, camera flashes reflecting in the glass, the low hum of generators. It was a new kind of noise, a human static that was, in its own way, as unnerving as the silence of the gray place. They lived with the curtains drawn, moving through their own home like ghosts, whispering when they were near the windows. Elias felt a suffocating, helpless anger. He had saved his daughter from a monster, only to have her cornered by a pack of wolves. On the 4th morning, help arrived in the form of Sheriff Brody's patrol car. He didn't come to the door. He parked his car at the entrance to their street, got out, and had a long, firm conversation with the assembled reporters. There was much gesticulating and pointing. Finally, Brody issued an official, no-nonsense statement, declaring the Thorne property off-limits and the family in need of privacy. He promised a formal press release from his office later that day and warned that any reporter found trespassing would be arrested. Reluctantly, grumbling, the media pack retreated, moving their vans to the end of the street. The siege was lifted. With the quiet restored, a different kind of challenge began. The weeks that followed were a delicate, painful navigation of the new landscape of their lives. The true ghosts of their ordeal were not in the park, they were in the house with them. Lily was plagued by nightmares. She would wake up screaming, not with loud, terrified shrieks, but with choked, silent cries, her hands over her ears, her body rigid. Elias would rush to her side, holding her until the trembling stopped, whispering reassurances that the tall man was gone, that the gray place couldn't reach them. He would sit with her until she fell back into a fitful sleep, his own heart aching with a grief that felt somehow deeper now that she was back. The physical search was over, but the work of retrieving her soul had just begun. She developed strange, quiet habits. She began collecting small, lost things, a loan button she found on the floor, a single, colorful autumn leaf from a yard, a dropped paperclip. She would arrange them in neat, deliberate patterns on her windowsill, her face a mask of intense concentration. It was an echo of the monster's obsession, a coping mechanism she had learned in the darkness, and it sent a chill down Elias's spine. He didn't have the heart to stop her. His own trauma simmered just below the surface. He was hyper-vigilant, his ears always tuned to the sound of Lily's breathing. He couldn't bear to let her out of his sight, following her from room to room like a shadow. Loud, scraping sounds made the muscles in his back tighten, and he found himself staring into dark closets and basements, a part of him still expecting to see a tall, thin figure unfold itself from the shadows. The memory of the cold, the feeling of the creature's grip on his ankle, the silent, internal explosion of the flare. These were ghosts of a different sort, and they were his alone to bear. About 2 weeks after Lily's return, Elias decided they couldn't stay hidden forever. He needed to show her that the world was still hers, that it wasn't a place to be feared. He chose a simple, low-stakes destination, the ice cream shop downtown. The short drive was tense, with Lily sitting silently in the passenger seat, her eyes wide, taking in the world with a wariness that didn't belong on a child's face. The shop was mostly empty. Elias ordered her favorite, strawberry with rainbow sprinkles, and they sat at a small table by the window. He watched her take the first, hesitant lick, her expression unreadable. Then, the small bell above the door chimed. A woman and her young daughter walked in. The little girl, who had blonde pigtails just like Lily used to, stopped short when she saw them. "Lily?" the girl asked, her voice full of childish surprise. It was Sarah, a girl from Lily's kindergarten class. Lily froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. Elias held his breath. The girl's mother, recognizing the impossible situation, tried to hurry her along, but Sarah just stood there. "I'm glad you're back," she said simply. "We missed you." Elias watched his daughter's face. A complex series of emotions washed over it: fear, confusion, memory. Then, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "Hi, Sarah," she whispered. It was a start. A crack in the ice. On the drive home, Lily was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. A thoughtful quiet. When they got out of the truck, she turned to Elias and said, "Sarah still has the sparkly shoes." It was the first normal, childish observation she had made since her return. To Elias, it sounded like a symphony. The days turned into a month, then two. The media finally gave up and left. The town's initial, fervent curiosity softened into a quiet, respectful sympathy. The nightmares became less frequent. The small, sad collections on Lily's windowsill were slowly forgotten, gathering dust. The healing was a slow, invisible process, like the knitting of a broken bone. One evening in late October, as dusk was settling in, painting the sky in soft shades of gray and orange, Elias felt a shift. He looked at Lily, who was sitting at the coffee table, finally completing the fantasy castle puzzle she had started over a year ago. "Hey, sweet pea," he said softly. "Do you want to go for a walk?" She looked up, a question in her eyes. He didn't have to say where. She knew. She simply nodded, took his outstretched hand, and they walked out the front door. They walked in silence, their footsteps the only sound on the quiet street. They entered the park. The air was cool and crisp. They walked past the slide and the monkey bars and stopped before the great oak tree. Before them stood the swing set. It was empty. It was motionless. The chains were silent. The supernatural hum that had once saturated the air was gone. The place was no longer a monument to loss, no longer a beacon to another world. It was just a playground, waiting patiently for the laughter of children in the morning. Elias looked down at his daughter. She was staring at the swing, her expression calm and clear. The fear was gone. He squeezed her hand. "It's just a swing set, Daddy," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Yeah," he whispered back. "It's just a swing set." They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, watching the twilight deepen around them. The monster was dead, the echoes were silent, and the ghosts had finally gone to sleep. All that was left was a father, a daughter, and a quiet, empty park, waiting for a new day. And for the first time in a very long time, the future felt like it was theirs again. The autumn that followed their return was a season of quiet healing, of drawn curtains and soft voices. Winter came, blanketing Oakhaven in a deep, muffling snow that seemed to insulate them further from the outside world. It was a time of hibernation, of recovery. Elias and Lily created a small, safe world for themselves within the walls of their home. He began homeschooling her, patiently reintroducing her to the simple joys of reading and arithmetic, subjects that had been rendered meaningless in the silent, gray world. They cooked together, read stacks of books from the library, and slowly, carefully, began to rebuild the life that had been stolen from them. The nightmares still came, for both of them, but they grew less frequent, their sharp edges dulled by the steady, peaceful rhythm of their new days. 6 months after Lily had reappeared on the park grass, the world began to thaw. The heavy snows receded, leaving behind the damp, earthy smell of impending spring. It felt like a great, collective exhalation, and with it came a sense of new beginnings. One Saturday afternoon, a familiar patrol car pulled up to their house. Sheriff Brody had checked in a few times over the winter, but this visit felt different. He found them in the backyard, working together to clear away the last of the winter debris from the small garden patch. Lily, though still quiet, moved with a confidence that had been absent months before. She smiled a shy, genuine smile at the sheriff, then went back to her task of collecting fallen twigs. "She's looking good, Elias," Brody said, his voice low as he leaned against the porch railing. "A world of difference." "Every day is a little better," Elias replied, his eyes never straying far from his daughter. I came to tell you something, Brody said, turning his hat over in his hands. I'm closing the case. Officially. The file will remain open, of course, but the active investigation is over. For the report, it'll say, victim recovered, perpetrator unknown, presumed deceased. Elias stopped his work and looked at the sheriff. You don't have to do that. If you still have questions. Brody shook his head, a wry, tired smile on his face. Lord knows I have questions, Elias. I've got a whole file cabinet full of them. I know the story you gave me has more holes in it than a screen door. I know what my deputies didn't find at that ice house. And I know what I saw in your eyes that night in the park. He paused, his gaze drifting over to Lily, who was now trying to coax a sleepy ladybug onto a leaf. But I also know a miracle when I see one. I've been a cop for 30 years. I've seen my share of missing kids. Their stories don't end like this. Ever. He looked back at Elias, his expression clear and resolved. I decided that whatever secrets you're holding, they're yours to keep. The only truth that matters to me is that she's home, and she's safe. That's a good enough ending for my book. I just thought you should know. A weight Elias hadn't even realized he was still carrying lifted from his shoulders. He reached out and shook the sheriff's hand. Thank you, Bill. For everything. Just keep that little girl safe, Brody said, clapping him on the shoulder. That's all the thanks I need. The sheriff's visit felt like the closing of a final chapter, the locking of a door to the past. The days that followed felt lighter, freer. The future, which had been a terrifying, formless void, began to take on a hopeful shape. And then, one rainy Tuesday, the sound Elias had been waiting for finally returned. He was in the kitchen, attempting to bake a cake from scratch, a project that was rapidly descending into chaos. He had misread the recipe, adding baking soda instead of baking powder, and was now trying to fish a piece of eggshell out of the lumpy, suspicious-looking batter. Frustrated, he threw his whisk into the bowl with a little too much force, sending a great plume of flour and cocoa powder up into the air and all over his face and shirt. He stood there, stunned for a second, a comical, black and white mess. Lily, who had been watching from the table, let out a small giggle. Then another. And then it happened. A great, wonderful, uninhibited peal of laughter erupted from her. It was a full-bodied belly laugh, the kind of pure, joyful sound that can't be faked. It was the sound he had heard in his memory in that dark, gray place. The sound of her old self, whole and unbroken. He stood there, covered in flour, and felt tears stream down his own dusty cheeks. He started to laugh too, a deep, cathartic sound of pure relief. The sight of him, a grown man covered in cake ingredients and crying with laughter, only made Lily laugh harder. The sound filled the small kitchen, chasing out the last of the shadows, the most beautiful and hopeful sound in the entire world. That evening, they sat together on the front porch swing, a gentle two-person rhythm that was all their own. The air was cool, and the setting sun was painting the melted snow on the distant hills in shades of pink and gold. Daddy? Lily asked, her voice quiet. Yeah, sweet pea. Do you think I could play soccer in the fall? With Sarah? Elias looked at his daughter, her face turned toward the future, and his heart felt so full it ached. He thought of the empty swing set in the park, a place they now walked past without a second glance. He could hear the faint, distant shouts of other children playing there as the day ended. The swing set had been the symbol of his grief, the center of his haunted world for so long. But he realized now that it was never about the swing. It was about the girl who was supposed to be in it. And she was right here, beside him, her laughter still echoing in the house behind them, ready to run and play again. Yeah, Lilybug, he said, pulling her into a one-armed hug. I think that's a great idea. The seasons turned, pulling them forward. The quiet, insulated winter of their healing thawed into a gentle spring, which in turn bloomed into a warm, vibrant summer. It was a time of rediscovery. For Lily, it was rediscovering the simple, unburdened joy of being a child, chasing fireflies in the backyard, feeling the sun on her face, the simple pleasure of a popsicle dripping down her hand. For Elias, it was the rediscovery of being a father, not just a protector. The constant, gnawing fear that had been his shadow for so long began to recede, replaced by a quiet, profound gratitude for these small, ordinary moments. Late August arrived, hot and hazy, thick with the scent of cut grass and the bittersweet feeling of summer's end. The future they had spoken of on that first spring evening was now upon them. True to her word, Lily still wanted to play soccer. The day of sign-ups at the Oak Haven Community Center was a hurdle Elias knew they had to clear together. The gymnasium was a cacophony of familiar, happy noise, the squeak of sneakers on polished wood, the excited shouts of children, the low murmur of parents chatting. To Elias, it was a sound both wonderful and terrifying. He felt a dozen pairs of eyes on them as they walked in, a ripple of whispers passing through the crowd. He instinctively put a protective hand on Lily's shoulder. She was clinging to his other hand, her knuckles white, but her chin was up, her gaze fixed on the sign-up table with a quiet determination that made his heart swell with pride. The woman at the table, a mother from town he vaguely recognized, gave them a warm, genuine smile that held no pity, only welcome. "Well, look who it is," she said gently to Lily. "Ready to show these boys how it's done this year?" Lily gave a small, shy nod, and Elias filled out the paperwork, his hand shielding the form as if it contained state secrets. He felt the weight of his town's collective memory, the knowledge that they were not just another family signing up for a sport. They were the Thornes, the father who had kept the vigil, the girl who had come back. But as he looked around, he saw that the stares were not hostile or accusatory. They were looks of quiet support, of a community that had grieved with him and was now, in its own way, celebrating with him. The first day of practice was harder. The soccer field was a wide-open, exposed space, a stark contrast to the safe confines of their home. Elias sat high up in the metal bleachers, a solitary figure in a sea of parental chatter. He watched Lily walk onto the field, looking impossibly small and fragile in her new cleats and oversized t-shirt. She stood at the edge of the group of kids, her arms wrapped around herself, an island of uncertainty. Elias's hands were clenched into fists. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run down there, to stand beside her, to shield her from the world. He had to physically force himself to stay seated, to breathe. This was a new kind of vigil. For a year, his post had been a lonely park bench overlooking a pair of empty swings, a vigil of grief and desperate, fading hope. Now, his post was a hard metal bleacher overlooking a field of noisy, running children, a vigil of fierce, protective love and burgeoning faith. He had to have faith that she could do this. He had to let her go. The coach blew his whistle, and the kids started their warm-up drills. Lily remained on the sideline, frozen. Just as Elias was about to stand up, another little girl peeled away from the group and ran over to her. It was Sarah, the girl with the sparkly shoes. "Come on," Sarah said, grabbing Lily's hand with the simple, unquestioning authority of childhood friendship. "Coach says we have to do 1,000,000 jumping jacks. It's horrible. You have to suffer with me." A tiny smile touched Lily's lips. She let Sarah pull her into the group. Elias watched, his breath caught in his throat, as his daughter began to move, her actions hesitant and clumsy at first, then growing more confident as she mirrored the kids around her. She was clumsy. She was out of practice. But she was there. She was a part of the noise. By the end of the practice, she was running. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair was sticking to her forehead with sweat, and a grass stain adorned the knee of her new shorts. She had touched the ball a few times, mostly by accident, but she was running with the pack. And Elias, watching from the bleachers, felt a joy so pure and fierce it left him breathless. On the drive home, the car was quiet for a few minutes. "I was scared," Lily said finally, her voice small, her gaze fixed on the setting sun. "Me too," Elias admitted. "But it was fun," she added, a note of surprise in her voice. Sarah fell down 3 times. Elias smiled. "It's okay to be scared and have fun at the same time," he said. "Sometimes, that's what being brave is." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "What happened to us? It's like a scar. You know, it's a part of us now. It might ache a little sometimes, especially when it's cold, but it's not who we are. It's just a line in our story. It doesn't get to be the whole book." Lily seemed to consider this. "So the tall man is just a scar?" "Yeah," Elias said softly. "He's a scar, and we're the people who healed." They drove past the entrance to the park as dusk settled. Elias glanced over. Other families were there, a father pushing his young son on a swing. The sight barely registered. It held no charge, no lingering ghost. It was just a park. His world was no longer defined by that empty space. It was defined by the living, breathing, grass-stained girl sitting beside him. "School starts next week," Lily said, her voice holding not fear, but a simple statement of fact, a milestone on a map she was now willing to read. "I know," Elias said, reaching over and squeezing her hand. "You're going to be great." He turned the car onto their street, their quiet home waiting for them at the end. The vigil was truly over. The soccer dad had arrived. The last week of August felt like a held breath. The successful navigation of soccer practice had been a triumph, but it was merely a prelude to the main event, the true test of their new reality, the first day of school. The night before, a nervous, electric energy filled their small house. They performed the familiar, time-honored rituals with a quiet, focused intensity. Lily carefully chose her outfit, a simple pair of jeans and a bright yellow t-shirt that reminded Elias of sunshine. She sharpened a dozen new pencils until they were perfect, needle-sharp points, and packed them in her new backpack, a bag that was, blessedly, free of any gray, otherworldly dust. Each normal action was a defiance of the abnormal world they had escaped, a small, deliberate step away from the shadows. Elias, for his part, made her favorite dinner and tried to keep the conversation light, but his heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. Later, after he had tucked her in and sung their song, he found himself unable to sleep. He sat in the darkened living room, the old hypervigilance returning with a vengeance. For nearly 2 years, his single all-consuming purpose had been to find his daughter, and then to keep her safe within arm's reach. Tomorrow, he had to willingly walk her into a crowd of hundreds, entrust her to strangers, and walk away for 7 hours. It felt like a betrayal of his most basic, hard-won instinct. He had to remind himself over and over that this was not an act of abandonment, but an act of trust. It was the final, most important part of her rescue, giving her back her own life. The morning was a blur of controlled chaos. At the breakfast table, Lily was so nervous she could only push her cereal around the bowl. Elias felt a mirror of her anxiety in his own stomach, but he projected a calm he did not feel. "You're going to be great," he said, for what felt like the 100th time. "And I'll be right there at the gate the second school is out." The walk to Oak Haven Elementary was a journey into a world they had avoided for months. The streets were filled with the energy of a new beginning, parents pulling wagons full of school supplies, kids on new bikes, the rumbling groan of a yellow school bus. As they approached the school, the sheer volume of noise and activity was a physical force. The shouts and laughter of children, the ringing of the first bell, the whistles of the crossing guards. It was the happy, chaotic sound of life, and it was overwhelming. Elias held Lily's hand tightly as they navigated the crowded schoolyard. He could feel a fine tremor in her small fingers. He led her through the main doors and down the brightly decorated hallway to her new classroom. A cheerful sign on the door read, "Welcome second graders. Mrs. Davison's class." A woman with kind eyes and a warm, steady smile stood at the door, greeting each student. She saw them approach, and her smile became softer, more knowing. "You must be Lily," she said, her voice gentle. "And you must be Mr. Thorne. It's a pleasure to finally meet you both." Elias knelt down. "Okay, sweet pea. This is it." He looked into his daughter's wide, nervous eyes. "You be good. You listen to your teacher, and I will see you right after school." He hugged her fiercely, then let her go. He stood up and had a brief, quiet word with Mrs. Davison. "She might be a little overwhelmed," he said, his voice low. "I know," the teacher replied, her gaze full of a compassion that was deeply reassuring. "The principal and I have spoken. We have a quiet corner in the classroom set up for her if she needs a moment. We'll take good care of her, Mr. Thorne. Go on now. It's okay. We've got her." Just then, Sarah appeared, her pigtails bouncing. "Lily, we're in the same class. Come on, I saved you a spot." She grabbed Lily's hand, and just like that, his daughter was pulled into the bright, noisy world of the second grade, disappearing into the classroom without a backward glance. Elias stood there for a moment, an anchor whose ship had just sailed. Then he turned and walked out of the school, the hallway feeling strangely empty. He returned to a house that was, for the first time in his memory, silent by choice. The quiet was no longer the heavy, grief-stricken silence of her absence, nor the tense, insulated quiet of their recovery. It was just empty. He wandered from room to room, the minutes stretching into agonizingly long hours. He tried to read, but his eyes scanned the same page over and over. He tried to start cleaning the garage, but he found himself just staring at the wall, his ears straining for a phantom school bell. He was a guardian without anyone to guard, a watchman whose post had been decommissioned. He had forgotten how to simply be Elias. He was at the school gate a full hour before dismissal, a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. What if it had been too much for her? What if she had a panic attack? What if the other kids were cruel? When the final bell rang and the school doors burst open, releasing a flood of children, his eyes scanned the crowd frantically. And then he saw her. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't crying either. She was just walking, her new backpack slung over one shoulder, talking seriously with Sarah. She looked normal. She looked like just another kid at the end of a long school day. Her face lit up when she saw him. She ran the last few feet and wrapped her arms around his waist. He held her tight, breathing in the scent of chalk dust and playground dirt. "So," he asked, his voice catching, "how was it?" She looked up at him, a tired but peaceful expression on her face. "It was okay," she said. "We did math. It's still boring. And Mrs. Davison has a guinea pig named Squeaky. Sarah and I get to feed him tomorrow." Elias laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. It was the most beautiful, most perfect report he could have ever hoped to hear. Boring math and a class pet. The glorious, wonderful mundane. They walked home together, her hand tucked securely in his. He listened as she told him about her day, the small details, the minor dramas, the simple observations of a second grader. He realized, with a clarity that was both startling and liberating, that she had done it. She had stepped back into the river of her own life. And in doing so, she had finally, truly, set him free. September gave way to the crisp, golden days of October. A new rhythm established itself, a cadence as steady and comforting as a heartbeat. Mornings were for school drop-offs, afternoons for pickups and soccer practice, evenings for homework and shared meals. For Lily, the world was expanding, repopulating with friends and teachers and the gentle, predictable challenges of a second grader's life. But for Elias, as his daughter's world grew, his own seemed to shrink. The hours between 9 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, once a terrifying void of her absence, were now just empty. He had successfully rescued her, navigated the media, and guided her back to the threshold of her own life. But in the process, he had forgotten how to live his. The house, once his command center, felt cavernous and still. He would find himself wandering its quiet rooms, picking up objects and putting them down, a man adrift in a sea of purposeless time. His singular, all-consuming mission was over, and he hadn't yet figured out what was supposed to come next. The answer, when it came, arrived through the telephone. He was staring out the kitchen window one morning when it rang, the sound jarring in the silence. He expected it to be the school, and his heart leaped into his throat with a familiar, reflexive panic. But the voice on the other end was a gruff, friendly one he hadn't heard in nearly 2 years. "Elias Thorne. George Henderson here. Am I catching you at a bad time?" It was his old boss, the owner of the small land surveying firm where Elias had worked for 15 years. "George," Elias said, surprised. "No, not at all. It's good to hear your voice. Yours too, son." "Yours too," George said, a genuine warmth in his tone. "Listen, I won't beat around the bush. I know you've had a hell of a time. And I was overjoyed to hear the news about your little girl. Truly, a miracle." He cleared his throat. "The reason I'm calling is, I've got a small job out on the old Miller property, way on the west side of the county. Simple boundary survey. Nobody for miles. I'm short-handed, and I thought of you. Thought maybe a quiet day out in the field might do you some good. It's just a one-day gig. No pressure if you're not up to it. I completely understand." Elias looked around his quiet, empty kitchen. The offer was a lifeline, a call back to a part of himself he had thought was gone forever. A day of straightforward work. A day with a clear, logical purpose. But the thought of it also brought a surge of anxiety. To be on the other side of the county, an hour's drive away from the school, from Lily, it felt like an impossible distance. That evening, he talked to her about it. He sat on the edge of her bed, the light from her bedside lamp casting a warm glow. "My old boss called today," he began. "He offered me a little bit of work. For one day. But it's kind of far away. I wouldn't be here when you got home from school." Lily looked up from her book, her expression thoughtful. She didn't look scared or worried. "Would Mrs. Gable from the library be able to pick me up?" she asked. The Gables were their elderly neighbors, kindly people who had offered to help any time. "Yeah," she said she could, Elias said, surprised by her practical, calm response. "Then it's okay, Daddy," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She gave him a small smile. "You should go. You look bored." Her simple, trusting permission was the key that unlocked his cage. He saw then that his fear was his own, a ghost he needed to exorcise. It was not her burden to carry. The next morning, he called George and accepted the job. Waking up the next day felt different. He had a destination. He pulled on his old, worn-in work boots and flannel shirt. He found his surveying equipment in the garage, dusty but in perfect order. The familiar, solid weight of the tripod and the cool, precise feel of the transit in his hands were deeply comforting. They were tools of a world that operated on measurable facts and immutable laws of physics. Out on the Miller property, the world was wide open. A vast, rolling field stretched out under a brilliant blue sky. The air was clean and cool. He set up his equipment, the process a familiar, meditative dance of muscle memory. He peered through the eyepiece, leveled the scope, and made his first reading. The world snapped into a sharp, clear focus, a grid of lines and angles. For the next several hours, there was only the work. The satisfying crunch of his boots on the soil. The careful scratching of his pencil in his field notebook. The quiet, focused solitude. He was measuring a long, straight property line when he paused, looking out at the distant tree line. He thought of the other map, the one seared into his memory. The twisting tunnels, the gray, timeless plain, the terrible, ancient tree. He knew, in a way no one else on this earth did, that the solid ground beneath his feet was not the only reality. He knew there were other places, dark and cold, just beneath the surface of things. But he also knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that this was the world he was choosing. This one. The world of sunlight and wind, of property lines and loving daughters, of boring math and soccer practice. He finished the job as the afternoon sun began to dip low, a satisfying sense of accomplishment warming him. He packed up his gear and drove home, the good, honest ache of physical labor in his muscles. He walked through the front door to the smell of toast and the sound of the television. He found Lily at the kitchen table, a half-eaten piece of cinnamon toast in her hand, watching cartoons, her homework finished and spread out beside her. The Gables had taken good care of her. The scene was so beautifully, perfectly normal it almost brought him to his knees. "Hey, sweet pea," he said, his voice a little rough. She looked up and broke into a huge smile. "Daddy, you're home. How was the boring field?" "The field wasn't boring at all," he said, dropping his keys in the bowl by the door. "And I brought you something." He pulled a small chocolate bar from his pocket. As they sat at the table, sharing the chocolate and talking about their respective days, his filled with angles and elevations, hers with guinea pigs and spelling tests, Elias felt a sense of equilibrium he hadn't experienced in years. He was no longer just a survivor, a guardian, a watchman. He was Elias Thorne, a land surveyor, a father, a man who had been to hell and back, and was now finally content to be home, building a new life on solid ground. October settled over Oakhaven, a glorious, slow-burning fire of red and gold. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. It was a season of cozy sweaters, warm apple cider, and the town's most beloved tradition, the annual fall festival. For a week, the town square was transformed into a cheerful maze of hay bales, corn stalks, and brightly colored stalls. In the years before, it had been a highlight for their small family. In the year of his vigil, Elias hadn't even noticed it happening. This year, it was a question mark, a challenge he wasn't sure they were ready for. The subject was broached by Lily. She came home from school one afternoon, her eyes shining with an excitement he hadn't seen in a long time. "Sarah says they're going to have a Ferris wheel at the festival this year," she said, her voice a carefully constructed casualness that barely concealed her hope. "And a caramel apple stand. She said we should go together." Elias's first, instinctual reaction was a flat, protective no. The thought of Lily in a large, unpredictable crowd, the potential for noise, for chaos, for the well-meaning but prying eyes of the entire town, it all sent a jolt of anxiety through him. But then he looked at his daughter's face, at the hopeful light in her eyes. This wasn't just about a Ferris wheel or caramel apples. This was about being a normal kid, about reclaiming a piece of her childhood, denying her that felt more dangerous than any crowd. "Okay, sweet pea," he said, the words feeling momentous. "Let's go to the festival." They went on a Saturday evening, as the sun began to dip low, casting long shadows across the town square. The festival was in full swing, a joyous, vibrant explosion of community life. The air was thick with the mingled smells of popcorn, grilling hot dogs, and sweet, spiced cider. A local bluegrass band played on a makeshift stage, their cheerful, twanging music a lively soundtrack to the evening. String lights were woven through the branches of the maple trees, their warm, golden glow creating a magical canopy. Lily's hand tightened in his as they stepped into the throng of people. Her eyes were wide, taking in the overwhelming sensory input. For a moment, Elias worried he'd made a mistake. But then Sarah spotted them and ran over, her face beaming. "You came," she squealed, grabbing Lily's other hand. "Come on, there's a ring toss game, and if you win you get a giant stuffed sloth." Lily looked up at Elias, a silent question in her eyes. He nodded, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Go on," he said. "Have fun. I'll be right here." He watched as Sarah pulled her toward the games, and for the first time, he let her go into a crowd. He stayed close enough to see her, but far enough to give her space, a satellite orbiting his own small, precious world. He leaned against a hay bale and watched her. He saw the initial nervousness on her face melt away, replaced by concentration as she threw the plastic rings, and then by a shared giggle with Sarah when they all missed. She was okay. She was more than okay. Quite a sight, isn't it? Elias turned. Sheriff Brody was standing beside him, out of uniform, wearing a comfortable-looking flannel jacket. Beside him was a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, who was holding the hands of two small, energetic children. "Sheriff," Elias said, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "Or should I say Bill?" "Bill is just fine," Brody said, grinning. "This is my wife, Mary. And these are our grandkids, terrorizing the festival for one night only." Mary's smile was full of a gentle, unspoken understanding. "It is so wonderful to see you both out," she said. "And Lily is looking so happy and healthy." She held out a small paper bag. "We just got some fresh cider donuts. Would she like one?" They stood there for 10 minutes, making small talk. They talked about the mild weather, the prospects of the high school football team, and the superior quality of Mary Brody's prize-winning pumpkin pie. They didn't talk about the case, or the ice house, or the long, terrible year. They talked like neighbors, like friends. In that simple, ordinary conversation, surrounded by the cheerful chaos of the festival, Elias felt the last of the walls around him crumble. He wasn't the town tragedy anymore. He was just Elias Thorne, a dad watching his kid play a carnival game. Later, after a sticky caramel apple and a failed attempt at winning the giant sloth, Lily pulled on his sleeve. "Daddy," she said, her eyes pointing upward. "Can we?" The Ferris wheel stood against the deepening twilight sky, its spokes traced in brilliant, multicolored lights. "You bet," he said. They climbed into the small carriage, and with a gentle lurch, they began to rise. The sounds of the festival faded below them, replaced by the quiet creak of the machinery and the soft evening breeze. As they reached the very top, the wheel paused, giving them a breathtaking, panoramic view of their world. The entire town of Oakhaven was spread out beneath them, a sparkling carpet of lights. He could see the school, the steeple of the church, the familiar layout of the streets. And over to the east, he could see the dark patch of the town park, its own lights a small, quiet cluster among all the others. He looked at it, and for the first time, he felt nothing but a distant, peaceful sense of perspective. The park, the swing set, the monster. It had once been his entire world, a universe of pain. But from up here, it was just one small part of a much larger, much brighter map. His world was not that dark patch of land. His world was the small, warm hand that had just slipped into his. "It's beautiful," Lily whispered, her eyes full of wonder. "Yeah," Elias said, his gaze on his daughter's face, silhouetted against the starry sky. "It really is." They walked home later that night, Lily's small prize, a plastic goldfish in a bag of water, held carefully in her hands. She was tired and happy, her face glowing with the memory of the evening. The air was cool and smelled of autumn. As they turned onto their street, Elias looked back at the faint glow of the festival in the town square. He felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling of having finally, truly, come home. They were no longer ghosts haunting the edges of the town. They were a part of its light, its noise, its life. They belonged. The brilliant fire of October bled into the stark, gray stillness of November. The trees, now bare-limbed skeletons, reached toward a sky the color of slate. It was a season of transition, a time for turning inward, for gathering close against the coming cold. Thanksgiving was approaching, and with it, the ghosts of holidays past. Elias found his mind drifting back to the previous year, a memory he had long tried to suppress. He remembered Thanksgiving Day spent alone in the silent hollow house, a single frozen dinner his only concession to the holiday. He had sat at the empty kitchen table, staring at Lily's vacant chair, the grief so total and suffocating it had felt like a physical weight pressing down on him, crushing the very air from his lungs. This year, the house was a different world. It was a haven of warmth and life, the air rich with the sense of cinnamon, roasting turkey, and melting butter. From the moment he woke, Elias felt a sense of profound, almost painful gratitude. He and Lily had spent the morning in the kitchen, a chaotic but joyful team. Flour dusted nearly every surface, and a smudge of pumpkin pie filling adorned Lily's cheek like a badge of honor. She was in charge of mashing the potatoes, a task she took to with a solemn, focused intensity, her small arms working tirelessly. Elias, meanwhile, basted the turkey, his movements easy and relaxed. They worked in a comfortable silence, punctuated by Lily's occasional questions and the sound of holiday music playing softly on the radio. Looking at his daughter, so present and vibrant in the warm, steam-filled kitchen, the memory of last year's desolation seemed like a story about someone else. The contrast was so stark, the blessing of her return so immense, that it felt wrong to keep it all to himself. On a sudden brave impulse, he wiped his hands on a dish towel, picked up the phone, and dialed a familiar number. "Bill," he said when the sheriff answered. "It's Elias Thorne. I know this is last minute, but Lily and I were making far too much food, and we were wondering if you and Mary might like to join us for dinner this evening." There was a surprised pause on the other end of the line. "Well, Elias, Bill Brody said, his voice full of a gruff, pleased warmth. "I think we'd like that very much." Their arrival a few hours later felt like the final, definitive closing of a circle. Bill and Mary Brody walked through the front door not as a lawman and his wife, but as friends. They brought a warm apple pie and a bottle of sparkling cider, their faces wreathed in genuine smiles. They fussed over Lily, complimenting her on the festive hand-drawn placemat she'd made, and the conversation flowed with an ease that would have been unthinkable a year ago. They gathered around the small kitchen table, the extra leaf added for the first time in years. The turkey was a little dry on one side, and Lily had been perhaps overzealous with the salt in the gravy, but none of it mattered. The food was secondary to the feeling in the room, a quiet, profound sense of contentment and fellowship. As Elias stood to carve the turkey, Bill raised his glass of cider. "Before we start," he said, looking at Elias, "I think someone at this table has more to be thankful for than just about anyone on earth. If you'd like to say a few words, Elias." Elias felt a lump form in his throat. He looked around the table, at the kind, weathered faces of his new friends, and at the beautiful, miraculous face of his daughter, watching him with trusting eyes. He didn't have to tell the impossible truth of what had happened to feel the impossible weight of his gratitude. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, his voice a little unsteady. "But I am thankful. I'm thankful for second chances, when it feels like all the chances have run out. I'm thankful for the kindness of neighbors and friends, who watch over you even when you can't see it." His eyes met Bill's in a moment of silent, shared understanding. "And most of all," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at Lily, "I'm thankful for my sunshine, for the light that came back home." Mary Brody wiped a tear from her eye, and a gentle quiet settled over the table. Then Lily, who had been waiting for her moment, slid off her chair. She walked over to Mary and shyly presented her with a folded piece of construction paper. Inside was a crayon drawing of their two families, stick figures with big smiles, standing under a bright, happy sun. "Thank you for being our friends," she had written in careful, second-grade print. The rest of the evening passed in a comfortable, happy blur of good food and easy conversation. After the Brodys had left, the house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the warm, settled silence of a home filled with contentment and the lingering aroma of a shared feast. Elias and Lily washed the dishes together, a new tradition they had started. As she carefully dried a plate, she looked up at him. "That was a good Thanksgiving, Daddy." "The best," he said, his heart so full he could barely speak. He looked around the warm, bright kitchen, at his daughter, safe and whole and happy. The ghost of her empty chair was gone, banished forever. In its place was a memory of laughter, of friendship, and of a gratitude so deep and powerful it felt like the foundation of their new life. They had been to the edge of the void and back, and had discovered that the most powerful magic in the universe was the simple, ordinary grace of a Thanksgiving dinner, shared in a home filled with love. Another year passed, turning the wheel of the seasons, pulling them further and further from the shadows. The story of Lily Thorne's mysterious return slowly faded from a shocking headline into a piece of Oakhaven's local lore, a modern fairy tale the town would tell for generations. For Elias and Lily, however, it was not a story, but the foundation upon which they had carefully, deliberately, built a new life. 2 years to the month after Lily had vanished, the world was a different place. Lily, now a confident and bright third grader, was no longer the quiet, haunted girl who had returned from the gray place. She was a whirlwind of energy and laughter. She had a close circle of friends, a fierce love for soccer, and a mischievous streak that was, to Elias, the most beautiful sight in the world. The scar of her experience remained, a quiet, phantom ache that might surface in a nightmare on a rare occasion, but it no longer defined her. It had been integrated into the fabric of her being, a testament to a strength she was only just beginning to understand. Elias, too, was transformed. He had returned to his work as a surveyor on a steady part-time basis, the familiar logic and order of the job a comforting anchor in his week. The empty hours of the day were no longer a void to be endured, but a space he filled with his own quiet pursuits. He had reconnected with old friends, joined a Saturday morning bowling league, and had even started a small vegetable garden in the backyard, a defiant act of putting down new roots. He was no longer a man defined by his grief or his vigilance. He was simply a father, a friend, a man at peace in his own life. Their small family of 2 had recently, and joyfully, expanded to 3. After months of careful consideration and Lily's persistent, well-reasoned arguments, they had gone to the county animal shelter. They came home with a small, scruffy terrier mix with intelligent eyes and mismatched ears. They named him Scout, and he filled the house with a new kind of chaotic, happy energy, his clicking claws on the hardwood floors a welcome addition to the sounds of their home. One crisp Saturday in October, the entire town of Oakhaven seemed to be gathered at the high school athletic fields. It was the final game of the youth soccer season, and Lily's team was in the championship. Elias stood on the sidelines with the other parents, a thermos of coffee in his hand, his cheers mingling with everyone else's. He was just another soccer dad, his heart pounding with every kick of the ball, and the sheer, wonderful normality of it all was not lost on him. The game was a tense, hard-fought battle. With less than a minute left on the clock, the score was tied. The ball shot out from a tangle of players at midfield and landed right at Lily's feet. For a moment, she seemed to freeze. Elias saw it, a flicker of the old hesitation. But then something shifted in her. She squared her small shoulders, her eyes narrowed with focus, and she took off down the field, the ball a loyal companion at her feet. She dodged one defender, then another, her movements fluid and sure. The crowd roared to its feet. She took her shot. The ball sailed through the air in a perfect, graceful arc and landed squarely in the back of the opponent's net. The final whistle blew a second later. The game was over. They had won. Lily's teammates mobbed her, a joyous pile of triumphant third graders. Elias stood on the sideline, the cheers of the crowd a distant buzz in his ears, his vision blurred with tears of a different kind. It wasn't just about the goal. It was about the look on her face in that moment, the pure, unadulterated confidence, the fierce joy, the absolute certainty of her own strength. The last of the ghosts had been well and truly banished, not by him, but by her. Later that afternoon, to celebrate, the three of them, Elias, Lily, and a very excited Scout, went to the park. The autumn sun was low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. They didn't go to the playground section. They went to the wide, open field on the other side, near the river. Elias threw a battered tennis ball, and Scout would bound after it with delirious happiness, his mismatched ears flopping in the wind, while Lily ran alongside him, her laughter bright and clear. Elias stood watching them, his heart full. His gaze drifted across the park, over to the playground. He could see the great oak tree, its leaves a brilliant canopy of orange and red. He could see the swing set. A family was there. A young father was pushing his two small children, their squeals of delight carrying on the breeze. The swings were not empty. They were full of life. He looked at the scene, and he felt no ache, no shadow of the past, no lingering chill. The story of the empty swing set, the story of his pain and his desperate search, was over. It had been replaced by this new story, the one unfolding right in front of him. A story of a girl and her dog, running laughing through a sun-drenched field. A story of a family, whole and healed, their future as bright and open as the autumn sky. He called out to his daughter, his voice full of a love that had proven stronger than any darkness, and he walked across the field to join them, his own story finally, blessedly, complete. The years flowed by, soft and steady, like a river returning to its course after a flood. The dramatic, jagged edges of their story were worn smooth by the gentle, relentless passage of time, leaving behind not a scar, but a quiet, foundational strength. The Thorne house was no longer a place of healing. It was simply a place of living, filled with the normal, happy clutter of a teenager's life, the comfortable presence of a gray-muzzled dog, and the deep, unspoken peace of a family that had endured the unthinkable and emerged whole. One evening in a late golden autumn, nearly 7 years after Lily had come home, she and Elias were taking their old dog, Scout, for a slow walk. Lily was 13, poised on the brink of young adulthood, with her mother's grace and her father's thoughtful eyes. She was taller now, her features having lost their childish roundness, but she still held his hand with the same familiar, trusting grip as they walked. Their path, as it often did, led them to the town park. It was dusk, that familiar, transitional time when the world holds its breath between the day and the night. The air was cool and carried the smoky scent of distant fireplaces. They walked in a comfortable silence for a while, watching Scout snuffle happily in a pile of fallen leaves. "Daddy," Lily said, her voice quiet and clear in the twilight. "Do you ever think about it anymore?" Elias didn't have to ask what she meant. The it was always there, a silent, unseen passenger in their lives. Not a looming shadow, but a piece of their shared history, like a faded photograph in a treasured album. "Sometimes," he answered honestly. "Not the way I used to. It's more like a dream I had a long time ago." "Were you scared?" she asked, a question she had never voiced before. "When you were looking for me, were you scared you wouldn't find me?" He stopped walking and turned to face her, his daughter, his miracle. "Every single day," he said, his voice thick with a memory of that old, familiar ache. "Being scared was like breathing. But being your dad, loving you, that was bigger than the fear. It was the map I followed in the dark." She nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. They had never needed to speak of the impossible details, of the gray place, of the tall man, of the whispers on the wind. They had their secret story, but the truth beneath it, the story of a father's love refusing to give up, was the only part that truly mattered. They found themselves, without any conscious decision, standing near the playground. It was empty now, the last of the day's children having been called home for dinner. The great oak tree stood as it always had, a silent, benevolent witness. And there was the swing set. Lily let go of his hand and walked slowly toward it. She stopped in front of the swing on the right, her swing. It was just an object of faded red plastic and metal, weathered by years of sun and rain. It held no power, no menace. It was just a thing. She reached out one hand and gave the seat a single, gentle push. It began to sway, a slow, rhythmic, easy motion. Back and forth. The soft, familiar creak of the chains was a quiet, peaceful sound in the evening air. It wasn't a ghostly movement defying the laws of nature. It was a swing, moving because she had pushed it. An act of simple cause and effect. An act of quiet, final control. "I'm not afraid of it anymore," she said, her voice soft but sure as she watched the motion slowly die down. "It's just a part of the story. It's not the whole story." "No," Elias agreed, coming to stand beside her. "It's not." They stood there for a moment, father and daughter, as the swing came to a perfect, final rest. "I was thinking," Lily said, turning to him, her face full of the future. "For my high school science project, I want to build a real telescope. Not a kit. A real one. So I can see the stars." Elias looked at his daughter, his brilliant, brave, wonderful daughter, who had been to a place of no light and now wanted to build a machine to gather it in from a million miles away. His heart felt so full it ached. "I think," he said, his voice full of a pride so immense it was almost holy, "that's the best idea I've ever heard." They turned and walked for home, Scout trotting happily beside them, the lights of the town beginning to twinkle on around them. As they left the park, Elias glanced back one last time at the playground. He looked at the bench where he had kept his long, painful vigil. He looked at the swing set at dusk. It was, after all, just a swing set. But it was no longer empty. His world was full to bursting. And in the fading light, he knew, with a peace that settled into the very marrow of his bones, that was the only thing that had ever truly mattered.